Hello, everyone. Friends, colleagues, and participants, many thanks for joining us today in this second edition of the workshop on political economy of Turkey. We initiated this workshop series in the hope that it could give stage to especially young scholars working on policy relevant issues that are related to Turkey and its most pressing social and economic problems. Our first workshop took place last year at London School of Economics campus in a small seminar room named after Graham Wallas, one of the founding scholars of political psychology and a legendary professor who used to teach at LSE in the beginning of the 20th century. Even though this year we are forced to choose an online medium due to the obvious reasons and the COVID crisis, and unfortunately won't be able to get inspired by such legendary spirits at the school, we are nonetheless very happy that we now have the chance to share our discussions with more than 200 registered participants over the course of today and tomorrow. Before we start, as organizers, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to some of the secret heroes behind the scenes who helped us at every step of bringing together this workshop and making sure that it reaches to you. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Systemic Risk Center and European Institute at LSE for supporting us both academically and financially in the past 2 years. In particular, big thanks go to Anne Lowe, Annette Doran, and Ludwig Campbell, who have been continuously helpful to us since the first moment we came up with the idea of organizing this workshop. Also, our appreciation goes to our scientific committee, namely Paul de Grau, Selva Demiral, Aslı Demirgüç-Kunt, Refet Gürkaynak, Timur Kuran, Adil Malik, Berkay Özcan, Dani Rodrik, and Potro Şelke, who kindly helped us pick the best papers from a large set of submissions, and some of whom will hopefully join us in the next 2 days. Last but not least, thanks to Mati and Lucas from the Systemic Risk Center, who kindly volunteers to be with us during the whole duration of the workshop in order to help us with any of the technical issues in case they arise. I know we are all excited about this new edition of the workshop, so without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to Jawad, who will outline the workshop details as well as initiating the first session as a chair.
Thanks, Orkun. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So this is the second edition of the workshop, and we have a great set of papers. By now, we are all familiar with the rules of the game, but let me quickly go through this. So we have 30 minutes uninterrupted presentation from our speakers. If there are pressing questions, please just write to me directly, and I will ask these questions to the speaker. Otherwise, please just wait by the end of the talk. Our discussants will have 10 minutes to basically discuss the paper, and then we will have the remaining 10 minutes for Q&A. We have, in the first session, we have 2 great papers. First one is by Elif Kubilay from University of Essex, and then the second one will be from Semih Tümen. Both are very important and policy-relevant papers on migration and education. If you have questions that come to your mind during the talk, please directly message your questions to me, and at the end of the talk, I will basically direct your questions to our speakers. So I think we should start now with Elif's presentation. Elif will present her work joined with Şule Alan, Ceren Baysan, and Mert Gümren, building interethnic cohesion in schools and intervention on perspective taking. So Elif, floor is yours.
Okay, now let me share my slides. Okay. Do you see it well, or?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is quite an attendance. So I would also like to thank Orkun and Jawad for this amazing workshop and including me in the program. So the paper that I will present today is about social cohesion. And as Jawad already introduced, this is a joint work with Şule Alan, Ceren Baysan, and Mert Gümren, who are all present, I think, today. So what do I mean about social cohesion? So I mean about, I refer to environments where there is high social capital. So think of environments where people trust each other. We have high tolerance among individual differences. There's high coordination among members. So I think you would all agree that an environment like this is beneficial for all of us. However, unfortunately, we experience non-cohesive environments, right? So we experience segregation, we experience violence and this ethnic and religious intolerance. So what to do in those type of environments? One very important efficient remedy is through public education. So public education found to be an important socializing force. And therefore, it might be important for policymakers to focus their strategies on educational policies that might rebuild the social capital. So now let me take you to such an environment where we probably you're all familiar with this, right? So since the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2011, Turkey received more than 3.5 million Syrian refugees, of which 1 million are school-age children. So of course now you have these refugee children in the country. What do you need to do? You need to integrate them into the public education system. So what did the Ministry of Education do? First, in the beginning, there were temporary education centers. In the centers, refugee children continued their learning in their own language, which is Arabic, and which is very different from Turkish. Then the Ministry of Education followed the direct school placement policy that I'm going to explain in a minute. And then recently they came up with cohesion programs. So what about this school placement policy? As I said before, the refugee children spent some time in these temporary education centers, then they distributed to public schools based on two parameters, based on their registered address and the capacity of the school. So an outcome of this policy was increasing sentinels from by the locals. So this included host students, this included teachers, locals, community. And I think I would say the highest burden was on teachers and school administrators. Why? Because they were not giving any guideline on how to deal with the situation. So now we come into the picture. So we here design an intervention, educational intervention, and at the core of this intervention, there is perspective-taking ability, which we believe is very important to build this social capital. So what is perspective-taking ability? This ability is helping you understand other people's thoughts and their feelings, right? So this is very basically putting yourself, the ability of being able to put yourself into other people's shoes, right? So in the psychology literature, it has been shown extensively that this development of this perspective-taking skills, meaning that the people with high perspective-taking skills, they are more likely to build trust, they are more empathetic people, they have higher communication skills. So then, if we invest in this ability, we might ultimately mitigate social exclusion. So by using this concept at the core, we designed this educational intervention, and this educational intervention has only the sole purpose of increasing perspective-taking skill among both host and refugee children. Right? So this was given in a very structured curriculum, which spans almost 15 weeks. And it included different types of games and stories and activities. And this was delivered by children's own teachers, own class teachers. So as I said, the concept was developed by researchers, and the design of the curriculum was provided by a multidisciplinary team in Bilkent University. So this was implemented during 2018-2019 academic year. And as I said, it had different types of activities, different types of games and stories, and they were making the students understand, analyze different social situations, understand social cues, etc. Right? And I would like to emphasize here, this is very important, that this intervention, this educational program was not about ethnicity. So we did not make direct references to ethnicity. This was not about let's be nice to refugees, let's just be welcoming. This wasn't about that. This was merely about developing perspective-taking skills, understanding beings that are other than you, not just people, also animals, creatures, living beings. Right? So here you see the first 7 weeks of the curriculum. As I said, this is a very structured curriculum. In the first week, so this was provided to teachers so that they have a structure to follow. Each week they know what type of topic they have to go through. In the first week, they start teaching students about empathy. What is empathy? First, let's learn about this concept. And in the second week, they start learning about different social cues, and so on and so forth. And each week they have a different material, like an activity or a video or a story to read, so that they better understand the topic of the week. And now this is one of the pages of the booklet, student booklet. So this is an activity. So there are, as you can see, there are 2 pictures. There are thought balloons. There are also speaking balloons. So students have to put the right sentences into the right balloons. Right? So here, as I said, for example, on the left-hand side, you see a boy picking the tail of a cat. So you need to understand that this cat is feeling pain, and you need to be able to find the right sentence into the cat's thought balloon. So as I said, this was not just about understanding human beings. So the theory of change we had in mind when we started with this project was we have several cohesion indicators, outcomes that we are dealing with here. So we want to see higher cooperation, we want to see higher trust, reciprocity, altruism, tolerance, and we want to see lower violence in the school ground. And our conjectured mechanism was this educational intervention is going to increase perspective-taking skills, and at the end, we will see an improvement in these cohesion outcomes. However, it could be the case that, of course, there are other economic mechanisms at work, right? So it could be the case that we are maybe making students less impulsive, maybe we are making them more compassionate, or the classroom culture is getting better, or they are getting ethnically less biased. So it could be the case that these are actually leading a change in the cohesion outcomes that we will see just in a minute. So in order to be able to say something about the mechanism, at the end of the results, I will show you how our treatment affected our conjectured mechanism, and also our other channels that might be affecting the outcome variables. So this is a cluster randomized trial. So we randomized at the school level and stratified by province and student absenteeism. Our sample includes 222 teachers, and from 80 schools, we have about 7,000 children from 3rd and 4th grades. So this is, on average, they're about 9 years old, and 19% of our sample is refugee children. Okay. These are the study sites. So we worked in 2 provinces in Turkey, Şanlıurfa and Mersin. So these are the provinces with very high number of refugees, right? So Şanlıurfa, as you can see, already has a direct border with Syria. And it is 20% of its population is composed of Syrians and refugees. And for Mersin, this number is 11%. And the timeline is as follows. So we first started with our baseline data collection in 2018 in Şanlıurfa and Mersin, which followed by, after the design, followed by training the teachers. So they were made familiar with the materials and the curriculum. And after that, they started delivering the curriculum to the students. So this was between November and April. And then after they finished covering the curriculum, we went to the schools, collected the baseline data, and COVID permitting, we want to collect long-term data in November, we'll see. So what are the outcome variables now we are considering here? So we have school information on school level peer violence. So we collected this through, in order to have this information, we asked someone in the school administration to keep a diary of very serious disciplinary events that happened in the last 10 days in the school ground. So these are very important, serious disciplinary events. On top of that, we have classroom level ethnic segregation. So in order to construct this measure that I'm gonna tell in a minute very in detail, we looked at the networks of the classroom network of the students. Then also we have information on student level of experience of verbal and physical violence. We know each teacher evaluated the students on their bad behavior. We have incentivized games that we had collected information on trust, reciprocity, and altruism. Then finally, we have some survey information collected through surveys on perspective taking, ethnic bias, impulsivity, etc. This is to be able to say something about the mechanism here. So I will briefly tell you how we elicited trust, reciprocity, and altruism. So when I present the results, they make sense. In order to elicit trust and reciprocity, we played this very basic, probably you're familiar, trust game. In this trust game, there is one sender and a receiver, and we told students that you are matched with someone in your classroom, but you don't know who this person is. Then we also told them that you could be a sender or a receiver, but you don't know your role yet. And here the game is. If you're a sender, you will be given, you have 4 tokens, and you need to decide whether to keep these tokens to yourself or send an amount to the receiver. Let's say you send Y, and if you send Y, this will be tripled on the way. So the receiver is going to receive 3 times Y. And then if you're the receiver, you need to decide by looking at how much tokens that you get, you need to decide whether you want to send some of it back to the sender or not. So our trust measure here is going to be how many tokens sender decided to send to the receiver, so Y, and our reciprocity is going to be the share of tokens sent back to the sender. So, and altruism is altruistic behavior. We elicited this through this famous dictator game. So students were given 4 tokens, and these tokens, they were asked whether they want to allocate these tokens between themselves and other children. So who are these other children? Now these other children are children who are not in their school, who are in schools in the same province as they are, and they don't know these children, and we told them that we were not able to pay a visit to those schools, so that these children are not able to get any gifts from us. So we have a modification here in this game. We randomize the recipient's identity at the classroom level. So what does this mean? So half of the class saw nothing about the ethnic identity, and half of the class saw that the ethnic identity of the recipient is Syrian. So this person was asked this question: how many of your 4 tokens would you like to give to a Syrian student who did not receive gifts from us? 0 to 4. And the other half did not see any information. Okay, so now let me go over the results. Here, before I talk about school level peer violence, I would like to make a note. In a given school, we haven't recruited all the classrooms, all the 3rd and 4th grades. Why is that? This is merely because of logistical constraints. In a given school, these are very big schools. So in a given school, there are on average 14 classrooms, and we were only able to recruit 3 classrooms. These were chosen at random. So we only treated these classrooms that I will refer to as project classrooms. So now in this table, the first 2 columns here are the analysis conducted here with the students from the project classrooms. So in the first column, what you see is that perpetrated refers to the number of violent events that are perpetrated by the students from the project classrooms. So when you look at the control, you see that in control schools, there are 1.9 such events that are perpetrated by students from the project classrooms. And you see that treatment is decreasing this by 1.2 events. So this amounts to 65% decline in the events that are perpetrated by project students. So in the second column, we have the victimization. So we were wondering whether we are making these students, children who are in the treatment group, vulnerable. Why? Because if you make people more trusting towards others, it might be the case that maybe they are more likely to victimize. So in order to understand that, we are looking at victimization. So here, victimize refers to the number of events that are victimizing the children from the project classrooms. So what we see is not the case, what we thought was not the case. So we saw that in treatment schools, victimization is also mitigated by 50%, right? So on average, there are 1.5 such events that are victimizing children in the control schools, and we see a decline, we see a 50% decline in treated schools. So now in the third column, I have the total events. What is this? This is project classrooms plus classrooms that are not recruited in the school. So the control mean of 7.8 tells me that in control schools there are 7.8 events, violent events happened. And when you look at the treated schools, you see that we decrease this by 2.3 events, right? So this is not statistically significant, but when you look at the number of observations that I have here, and when you look at the coefficient side, this is still a substantial effect. And finally, in the last column, I'm looking at the spillovers. What does this mean? I'm now trying to understand whether this treatment had any effect on classrooms that are not recruited. And you see that again, there are 6 violent events in the control schools on average, and you see that in the treated schools we observe 1 less such event. Now let me talk about ethnic segregation in the classroom. So in order to construct this measure, we first looked at the size of the classroom and size of the host students and the size of the refugees in a given classroom. By looking at those, we calculated the share of inter-ethnic ties if ties to be formed at random, right? So what would be the share of ethnic ties if ties were to be formed at random? Then we also asked students their 3 best friends. And by looking at the information that they gave us, we calculated the observed share of inter-ethnic ties. And the difference between these two gave us a measure of ethnic segregation. So here, we illustrate here 2 different classrooms. Here on the left-hand side, you see, so these are classrooms of equal size and they similar number of refugees and host students. So R stands for refugee and H stands for host. So here, what you see is that, for example, on the left-hand side, this is a more segregated classroom. Why? Because you see that, for example, refugees are a group here. They are not connected to the rest of the students. And there are other refugees that are connected. However, they are more at the edge of the classroom network. When you look at the right-hand side, this is a less segregated classroom. There are refugee students who are connected to the host students, right? And there are even some refugees that are more in the center of the classroom network. So now let's look at the treatment effects here. In the first column, I have the friendship networks. And here...
let me briefly interrupt you. So we have 2 clarification questions. So Bilge Yabancı is asking, could you please clarify the control group? That wasn't clear from the presentation.
Excuse me?
Could you please clarify the control group?
The control
setting?
group.
Yeah.
The control group, so there are 80 schools in our sample. So 40 schools are chosen as treatment schools and the 40 schools are chosen as control schools. So these constitute our control group. And
Avital Livni is asking, how were the spillover effects measured? It wasn't clear from the description in the presentation.
Sure. So spillovers are only the violent events that happen, that are triggered by students who are not in the project classrooms. So here in the first two columns, we only have the violent events that are triggered by students in the project classroom. But in the last column, as I told you, that in a given school, we were not able to recruit every classroom. Right, so there's classrooms that are not recruited, so the spillover is for the classrooms that are not recruited in the school.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so now here, this is the treatment effect for the classroom level ethnic segregation. So here the control mean of 11 percentage points tells me that the fraction of interethnic ties are 11 percentage points less than what I would have expected if the ties were to be formed at random, right? And when you look at the treatment here, treatment effect here, this educational program is decreasing segregation by 2.2 percentage points, right? And in the next two columns, I have different types of networks. We also elicited emotional support ties in the classroom and also academic support ties in the classroom. And again, you see that treatment is mitigating segregation in these different types of networks as well. Next, I will talk about my student level cohesion indicators. So if we remember, the trust measure, we elicited this through the game, and this was the number of tokens out of 4 that you would like to send to the receiver. So here in the control group, students are on average sending 1.4 tokens to the receiver. And in the as you can see, treated children are sending 0.28 more tokens to the receiver, right? So we see an increase in the trust measure here. And when you look at the second column, which is the reciprocity, which is the share of endowment sent back to the sender in the control group, students, it looks like students are sending 39% of all the endowment received back to the sender. And you see that in treated children are sending 5.4 percentage point more to the sender, right? And when we look at altruism, here we both have the intensive and the extensive margin. In the first column, we have the willingness to donate. So willingness to donate is equal to 0 if you don't want to donate anything. So if you remember, they were given 4 tokens. If they don't want to donate anything, this is 0. And if they want to donate anything more than 0, this equals to 1. So in the control group, 70% of all students, they are willing to donate more than 0, right? And you see that treated children are 7.4 percentage points more likely to donate their tokens. And if you remember, we had a tweak in the game. So we were randomizing the ethnic identity at the classroom level here. And you see that if the ethnic identity here is to be revealed as Syrian, children are 3.3 percentage points more likely to donate their tokens. This is, however, of course, significant only at the 10% level, but you see that if the ethnic identity is revealed as Syrian, they are more likely to donate more than 0. So this was the only game that we made ethnicity salient and wanted to see whether it is an effect of it. And in the second column, I have the intensive margin. I now look at the fraction donated. The control children, they are donating 34% of what they have to this anonymous recipient, and treated children as before, they are donating 5.6 percentage points more. And when you look at the interaction between treatment and ethnic reference, now we see that there is no effect of ethnic reference when you look at the intensive margin. Right? So students are not affected by if the identity revealed, that they are not contributing differentially. Okay, now I have one bonus result here. So this is so we have seen an improvement in the cohesion indicators, right? We have seen now in the school ground there is less violence. We see that we observe less segregated classrooms. We saw improvement in trust, reciprocity, and altruism, all pro-social attitudes that we were considering. Now we also wanted to look at the test scores of these children, right? So we conducted standardized math and Turkish tests. And when you look at the treatment effects here, you see that for host children, we have null treatment effects. But when you look at the refugee children, the treated children are scoring 0.14 standard deviation more in Turkish tests score, which is a very nice result. And it was not surprising, honestly, after seeing all these improvements in the pro-social attitude and the other social cohesion indicators. So, okay, I think I was a bit fast, but so this is the last table graph that I will show you the result. So as I told you before, we were thinking that our mechanism is increasing perspective taking skills, right? In order to, but we were thinking also that there might be other mechanisms at work, as I discussed before. Why did we think this was only through perspective taking? Because the intervention was really only about perspective taking, understanding social situations, social cues. So in order to see how treatment affected this, our conjectured channel and other potential channels, here in this graph, I'm plotting the coefficients with 95% confidence intervals. And first, what you should pay attention here is that the treatment, this educational program affected all the potential channels in the direction that is intuitive, right? We see better classroom culture, we see less ethnic bias students, we see high perspective taking, less impulsive students, and they have more compassion, right? But what you see here is that perspective treatment increased perspective taking much more than the others, right? Treatment is increasing here, this coefficient is 0.27, so treatment increases perspective taking skills by 0.27 standard deviation, right? And this is significant. And when you look at the other potential channels that we were considering, most of them are only significant at the 10% level. Only impulsivity was significantly reduced at the 5% level, but as you can see, the size is not as much as perspective taking. So of course, this is not to say that these are not contributing factors, what we have found in this study, but main driver seems to be like an increase in perspective taking skills. Okay, so to conclude, we are evaluating a novel social cohesion program in a difficult time, in a confusing time, especially for teachers, school administrators with damaged social capital. And this program, as I said, encourages perspective taking skills, right? Increasing perspective taking skills. And this was implemented between 2018-19 academic year. And we see an improvement in most of the social cohesion indicators. We even see the effect of this program on test scores. Now, there is a long-term data collection that we are planning to do in November, hopefully, to see whether this effects persist in the long run. And of course, there's also the scale up of this program by the ministry. This is an ongoing work, and of course, this COVID complicated everything, but this is a very beneficial program, obviously, from the results. Okay, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elif. So now we have our discussant, Eliza Cavatorta from King's College London.
Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
I share my screen.
Eliza, you have about 10 minutes.
Yeah. You see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eliza Cavatorta. I work at King's College London. I was really pleased to have an opportunity to discuss the paper by Sule, Jeren, Mert, and Elif. I mean, have you heard, there's a fascinating paper on building interethnic cohesion in schools. I'd like to start my discussion by by emphasizing a little bit the concept of perspective taking. And the authors look at perspective taking. They say in the paper and define the perspective taking as a cognitive process of viewing a situation from the perspective of another paper. And this is so if my understanding of the literature, what does this mean in practice? A person. So what it means is that a person's ability to understand another person's objectives, so their wants, their motive of actions, and their motives of their emotions. So basically, what another person wants, what another person wants to, how he wants to act, and also why they feel the way they feel. Give me a second, sorry. There you go, okay. And so it is quite common to mistake the perspective taking with the thinking of what would I do in a different situation. And the author make a fantastic job in distinguishing perspective taking from empathy, from other type of skills, although perspective taking is a skill, and in that sense, it might interact with other cognitive ability. And I think it's important to recognize that perspective taking skills can interact with other skills that are important for the way the authors implement the interventions. Particularly, I think the skill for imagination and the skills of abstraction. I will come back to this later. And I think it's also important to recognize this definition of a person's ability to understand another person's objective, the motives of their action, and their motives of their emotion in terms of how we measure perspective taking and what are the underpinning channels of the theory of change. So I'd like to talk in my discussion about 4 points, mainly the measurement of perspective taking, the outcomes, and some thought about the class composition. And then I'll conclude with some potential additions, which I thought might be interesting to add in the paper. So in terms of measurement, I do appreciate a lot the difficulties in measuring perspective taking. And the authors decided to measure perspective taking using self-assessment by the children at the end of the intervention, using their self-assessment against 4 sentences, which I list here from the paper. And these are very socially desirable things to do. So I wonder if the tendency to respond in a socially appropriate way might itself be a result of the training. And I was wondering if you have considered other type of measures, for example, more behavioral measures that reflect better the skills that the children have acquired, and in behavioral situation when the skills is in action. And secondly, I was wondering if you are worried or not about social desirability bias in this type of measurements. So because paradoxically, within the context of a self-reporting measure, perhaps a better measure might have been considering the ability of the respondent to take perspective of a socially not so acceptable behavior. Then my second set of thoughts are about outcomes. There are, have you seen in the paper, there are many different outcomes, and this is kind of understandable for a very innovative intervention. And but some of them are less related to the theory of change underpinning perspective taking. Some are more clearly related, some less. For example, let me start with a very good point. I think in the paper, it was very good to see an effect. The test of the effect on victimization, and in particular the decrease in victimization in treated children. This was very good because allays the concerns of the harsh critic of perspective taking that consider perspective taking a factor contributed to vulnerability, in the sense that because good perspective takers are generally people that understand situation, conflicting situation better. They are more, they pause before acting, and then they can also be, in a sense, more vulnerable to take and slower to take action when action is to be taken. But also, according to some critic of perspective taking, they might be seen as subject more accepting of bad behavior. And in a different way, I was wondering why you would expect a change, for example, in certain measures that are less clearly related with the skill of perspective taking. For example, why would you expect a change in altruism towards an anonymous other and to some extent also to an anonymous others in the trust game, when there is in fact very little perspective taking in those type of tasks? Third, I would have liked to see in the paper a little bit more details about the composition of the classes to allay concerns of differential trends in which might impact the evaluation as such. So, and I make this a little bit clearer. So you see, you saw in the paper that there is no, the proportion of refugees versus host population do not vary between treatment and control, at least in the mean. But I was wondering if you could show the entire distribution of those proportions. And in particular, I was wondering to what extent does the class composition changes throughout the previous years before the intervention and during the academic year of the program. I remember in the paper you mentioned that there are seasonal agricultural workers that come into, that leave the community and then come back to the community of the intervention in November, which presumably is after the randomization took place, and presumably when the academic year has already started. So I was wondering about the process of allocation of the children of these workers. Because if by chance the composition of the classes changes during the years, then this might potentially affect some of your outcome, in particular the formation of friendships ties. And I was thinking about the following, that perhaps in classes who see classmates more, the same classmates throughout the previous years, then you would observe less changes in ties during the program years. And then depending on the relationship of that with the treatment, then your results might be overestimated or underestimated. Then I had kind of a clarification and a comment on the timing of the evaluation. The program took place over 15 weeks, so which is about 4 months. And the evaluation took place in October of 2018 and the follow-up in May of the following year. So I was wondering if the time lag between the week 15, so the end of the program, and the follow-up are comparable between the treatment and the control. And I was thinking this is important in case the treatment has, for example, a decay effect, or more importantly, if there are other activities that might or might not affect cohesion in the interim between the end of the program and the start of the evaluation. And finally, I had some thoughts about potential additions, which I think it might be interesting to see in the paper. One is about whether or not it makes a difference who teaches perspective taking. In particular, I was thinking about the beliefs of the teacher themselves, or the narratives of the parents, or perhaps even the prejudices of the teachers in relation to the integration of the refugees. A second, I think it would be helpful to have some sort of cost effectiveness measure of the intervention, particularly for scaling up and particularly for replication elsewhere, and in comparison with other types of social cohesion activities, if possible. And lastly, I thought that it might be interesting to look at the treatment effect in different groups characterized by the presence and the absence of other activities. For example, team sport at schools or other team playing activities that the teacher organizes, to go just some ideas of the magnitude of the effect spanning from the perspective taking training relative to, for example, other school activity that might improve cohesion. That's were my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Elisa, thank you very much for your comments. Elif, would you like to take a couple of minutes to reply Elisa's comments?
Yes.
But we also have pending questions from others, so.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, and also, I think I have Shule here if she wants to jump in and say something, it's fine. So first of all, in terms of how we measure perspective taking, as also Elisa acknowledged, it's in a field experiment, large-scale field experiment. The way that actually the psychologists do this through different type of vignette stories or through videos, so that they measure this perspective taking skills. But it was very hard for us to do this on the field. So we were really constrained, and it was even like a miracle that we were able to do this trust game and the other coordination games. So that was why we used we wanted to go with the survey questions to have a measure of perspective taking to be able to say something. And why we thought the perspective taking, for example, could affect altruism. First, this was making donations towards anonymous recipients, but these recipients are in schools, and we told the students that we were not able to pay a visit to these schools. And as an outcome, as you might have seen in the paper, that the games were incentivized by gifts. As an outcome, these children were not able to get any gifts. So we were saying this, so we were not able to pay a visit to these children, so they didn't get any gifts from us. So would you like to donate? So you have what you have, but if you want, you can donate. So we thought maybe they take the perspective of that child and take, okay, maybe it would be nice to donate some or not. So this was the reason. And also altruistic behavior is an indicator of pro-social behavior. So it was important for us to also include altruistic behavior. And among others, yeah, it might be a good idea for us to check the distribution of the refugees across treatment and control groups, whether there's any difference. I took a note of that. And in terms of cost effectiveness, we can create a measure, we can consider that, but I believe what I would like to note here is that this intervention was quite cost effective in the sense that there was the only cost was only to create the material which is already done, and it would be just the distribution and the publication of these materials. And there's only, this was a day of teacher training, which was about, I think, 3 hours to 4 hours. And this is the only cost that goes into that. So I would say that I didn't make any calculations, but I would say that this is quite a cost-effective intervention. But yeah, you're right. It might be worth creating a measure to provide some comparison to the other studies. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Elif. So Bilge has a question. Bilge Erten. Bilge, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So this was a very interesting presentation, and I think a very promising study. Thank you for really insightful results. I was wondering, given that there were some classrooms that were left outside of the study within the same school, and I know you showed the spillover effects in terms of violence, but did you also get to test the spillover effects in terms of reciprocity, trust, altruism, these other measures? Because if potentially there's some spillover in this type of behavior, like in the sense that some of the students might be friends with some of the students in the treatment groups, I was wondering if you looked at that. And also I was wondering if this treatment also changes the behavior of the students vis-a-vis the teachers. Mm-hmm. Does it, for example, does it change how the refugee students interact with the native teachers?
So the first answer to the first question is unfortunately no. So this was something that we really considered at some point to collect information on the classrooms that we couldn't recruit, but we couldn't do it again due to logistical constraints. So what we did in the field, it took already 3 to 4 lecture hours to collect information, and this was already quite a lot to ask from the teachers, so we couldn't do that. The answer to the second question, what was the second question? Sorry, it just slipped off my mind.
I was wondering if it changed the behavior of the refugee children to the teachers, if they become more trusting, for example.
So we don't have, I'm thinking whether we have some way of measuring the interaction between the teachers and the refugee children, and I think we don't have information on that, so I'm not going to be able to say something. But what we looked at whether this education, this intervention made maybe teacher more high, maybe it gave them a higher perspective as well. So we conducted this ICE test score, which is measured cognitive empathy, and I believe we haven't seen any significant differences in the cognitive ability of the cognitive empathy of the teachers. But in terms of interaction, we don't have any information on that, or maybe I'm missing something in our data, but it's something that's also interesting and worthwhile. Yeah, I will think about this, whether we have something in the data that we can dig out. Thank you.
Thanks.
Burak Sönmez has a question as well. Burak, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the presentation, Elif, and for study. So I think I got one question just to clarify the nature of endowments using the trust game and the dictator game. I think you mentioned it was sort of gifts, but I didn't really understand the exact nature of that. And that would be great if you clarify on that. And my second question is related to more about treatment effect heterogeneity, whether you measured through some cognitive inabilities, if you have sort of the measurements in your study, if you just in the pre-treatment process were you able to measure some cognitive inabilities for the students? Because I assume there should be some variety. And given that the games were played by non-adults, I'm really curious about more information about like how the games were conducted, because I think there's a sort of a limited literature in behavioral economics as well, like those games generally played by adults. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the question. So, in terms of gifts, so these, in order to incentivize the game, so usually when you do this in the lab environment, you give money or vouchers. So what you can give to children are, what are they excited about? They are excited about different types of toys and stationery materials. So what we did, we went to the classrooms with a bag of toys and stationery like materials, like different types of attractive pens and erasers. And then we told students, look, we will play these games, and at the end of the games, you are going to get some gifts from us. This will be based on how you are going to make decisions in the games. And we told them we had this token concept. We say that just imagine a token, imaginary token, and this token is one token corresponds to one gift, one toy or stationary material from our bags. So this was the nature of the gifts, and we always pilot these gifts before we go into the field, so that we know which type of gifts that they are most excited about, and so good to use for incentivization. In terms of cognitive inability, what we did was to ask each teacher whether there are any students in their classrooms that are cognitively, mentally challenged. Of course, there are not so much of a specific, a very particular type of high degree of cognitive inability in the classrooms, but there are some mentally challenged to lower degree mental challenged students. And what we do is that we take a note of the students, and this is all in our data, and we control this in all our regressions. And the games, the conduct, how did we conduct games? So this is done by me and my co-authors, basically. We do this by ourselves. We visit schools, and this was the challenge that we always face in this type of field studies. We go to the classrooms by ourselves. We don't let any field assistants to do this incentivized games but us, because we are the only ones who are able to, understand how the game works and how to deliver the game. So what we did was we had a guideline to follow in the classrooms, and we followed the guidelines and conduct the games pretty much standardized. And note for the cognitive inability, we also control in all our regressions Raven score. Right, so the Raven score gives you an idea of the cognition of the students. So this is something we also control in our regressions. Thank you.
Thanks, Elif. So we have time for one more question. Arda Şahinkaya from EBRD will ask you his question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Elif, and other contributors for this very promising presentation. My question is related to one of the potential additions Eliza made, the first potential addition, which was about teachers, but this time not teachers, but parents, families. So the question is where we can put the role of families, parents in children's process of socialization, especially how to deal with the situation when there are strong contradictions between what's being taught in the program and the parents' families, traditions, the origin country culture, deeply scaled customs. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, that's very important indeed. And when we started with this project, we actually even prepared a survey for parents that we had to discard due to, again, logistical constraints. And these are all very hard places to work with in terms of how parents are there for children. So when you go to schools, teachers, they also say that it's important that we also interact with parents, but parents are not always there for the children. And also be taught that it's a good starting point to do this in the classroom. Why? Because these students, they are spending most of their time interacting with their teachers. And in Turkey, in the elementary school, your teacher is like your mother or your father. So because you're with the same teacher from the first year until you go to the secondary school. But I totally agree that it is very important also, and that could be probably another study to do something with the parents. But what we did, I think, in terms of cost effectiveness as well, it was easier to implement, to reach children, and more tractable. So I think we all thought that, I think my co-authors would also agree that this was a good starting point for us. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Elif, thank you very much for the great presentation, and Eliza, thanks for the great discussion. So now we will take a short break for about 5 minutes, and then we will resume with Semih's presentation. Feel free to go have your coffee, which I will do, but I will see all of you in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. So the second paper of the day will be from Semih Tümen. Semih will present his paper, Mixing in Early Childhood, Evidence from Syrian Refugees in Turkey. Semih, you have 30 minutes. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks for organizing this workshop and also including our paper into this wonderful program. Well, not only the program is wonderful, I also skimmed through the list of participants, so it's a great pleasure to present here in front of this audience. So the title of our paper is Mixing in Early Childhood, Evidence from Syrian Refugees in Turkey. It's a joint work with Vincent, Michael, Jackie, and Il. It is really a work in progress. So the paper has 3 parts. Today I'm going to present only the first part, the experimental design and the reduced form results. But there's a theory part and also a structural estimation part, which are more or less complete, but not ready for presentation yet. But I'm going to discuss about, I'm going to mention, give some hints about the remaining 2 parts at the end of my presentation. Our focus in this paper is to estimate the impact of randomized exposure to refugee concentration or refugee intensity, let's say, in the classroom on various outcomes of interest. So these outcomes of course, refugee and Turkish children. The target group is age 5, so those are preschool kids. I will start with a brief motivation of the paper, and then I will briefly talk about the policy environment in terms of the school integration efforts of Syrian kids into the public education system in Turkey, because it's going to be relevant for the motivation. And then I will talk about the design, the empirical setup, and results, and I'm gonna give some links to the related work in the literature at the end, and then I'm gonna conclude. Okay, All right, so it's been almost a decade since the Syrian conflict started generating huge refugee waves. I say refugee waves because it's not like a one-shot event. It started in late 2011 and it continued until early 2017. And I mean, the number of Syrian refugees in major host countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey has been more or less stable since the second half of 2017, let's say. But we do not see a massive return movement. We do not see a systematic repatriation effort. And this is mostly due to a lack of inclusive political environment and political stability in Syria. So therefore, the refugee presence is a long-term phenomenon in the host countries, and providing education to Syrian kids, and more generally integrating them into the education systems in Turkey is a really important policy priority in host countries. So, and along with this perspective, the Ministry of National Education in Turkey has put really enormous effort into achieving this goal, of course, in collaboration with local and international stakeholders. Various programs have been implemented, and there is a very intensive policy learning going on. So let me give some basic facts. So this is for the 2019-20 academic year. So there is around 1,100,000 Syrian children of school age in Turkey, and it is even greater than that as of the current academic year. So the Syrian children are subject to several vulnerabilities, and they need urgent support to minimize the impact of war and conflict on their current and future outcomes. So this support is needed along several dimensions, ranging from, I mean, psychological support, counseling, to support for removing language barriers, and from increasing academic success to providing sustained high quality education. So the main issue is that the education and skill gaps may persist into future generations, which may generate high socioeconomic risks for the society as a whole. So these are the basic enrollment figures. As you see, so the enrollment rates, so this is for the 2018-19 academic year, so it is very high for the primary school age, around 60% for secondary school age, less than 30% for high school, and again for the preschool it is like around 35%. So the efforts of the Ministry of National Education, the integration efforts, the initial efforts, were mostly concentrated on this part, increasing the enrollment rate of secondary and high school students, and most of the effort and programs were designed to really increase school enrollment and integration at that grade level. So what were the main nature of the interventions and activities? So the most intensive activity was Turkish language training. So around 500,000 Syrian kids were provided language training by 5,000 teachers over 3 years. There are also some statistics for 2020, but I could not get it now, and I mean, I don't know whether I will ever get it because of the COVID issue, and so this online training, etc. So things became complicated. The other two interventions, backup and catch-up training programs. So these are mostly academic support programs. Backup training is designed especially for the enrolled Syrian kids with low academic achievement. So this is like a increase their level of academic success. And catch-up training is for, the target is the out-of-school Syrian kids. So the main goal of the catch-up training program is to, provide academic support out of school Syrian kids and facilitate their transition into the education system. And also there are also teacher and administrative staff training programs. Well, those are key, key stuff in the process. So they have direct interactions, direct contact with Syrian kids, and their support and collaboration is of primary importance, both for academic success and also the quality of integration of Syrian kids. And there are also other support programs. These are like providing in-kind support, stationery, textbook, clothing, school bag, transportation. There are also school level supports like providing cleaning stuff, security stuff, cleaning materials, and also other educational material. And there are also conditional cash transfers. This is not directly provided by the Ministry of Education, but Ministry of Education is a partner. So it provides some cash transfers to Syrian refugee families in exchange for the school enrollment and school continuation of their kids. All right, so there are some lessons learned, of course. So generally speaking, these interventions have been effective, have been somewhat effective, but the observed improvement in the outcomes of refugee children are rather modest relative to costs. So the main, one of the lessons is that efficiency improvements are needed. So Syrian kids face adaptation problems to the education system. So some are forced to stay out of school during the transition process. So that's one reason. In addition to these transition lags, so they are new in a foreign country, and it naturally takes time for adjusting into changing conditions. And there are also several socioeconomic problems that keep them out of school. So for males, it is mostly child labor. For females, it is teenage marriages, etc. And there is one more lesson learned. So the earlier, the better. Right, so the earlier the interventions are provided, the higher the effectiveness of the intervention. So these are reported at several reports, and also impact analysis of the Ministry of National Education Program. So based on this, the earlier the better lesson, they decided to shift the focus of, at least partially shift the focus of these interventions toward the early childhood period. So as a consequence, as a first step, they designed, let's say, a pilot program, which they called the 2019 Early Childhood Summer School Program. So this program targets Turkish and foreign students of preschool age, mainly age 5, and the program is designed and implemented by MONE. So the program had like 2 major and 4 additional rather minor goals. The two major goals are the first, and I don't know why I put this items in this order, but 1 and 3 are the major goals, and the rest are the rather minor. Those are also important, but they are rather minor goals. The first goal is to improve social integration by bringing together Turkish and foreign kids of preschool age, so they to start social integration at the preschool level. Second, to improve their Turkish language skills, which is very important for integration. Third, to start integrating them to educational system early on, so which is called education integration. So the fourth goal is to provide early childhood education to disadvantaged kids, because this program is specifically designed for disadvantaged Turkish and Syrian kids who did not receive any form of early childhood education before. The fifth goal is to prepare Turkish children and their parents to a multicultural education environment, which is another barrier in front of integration. And finally, familiarize Syrian kids with the Turkish culture, norms, etc. So these are the main goals of the summer school program. So other details. So the program started to be implemented on the 1st of July 2019 and ended on August 31st, 2019. So it's a 9-week program, intensive early childhood program, implemented in 26 provinces. So these are the, provinces determined by the European Union, who provides the European Commission, who provides the FRIT funds, and also by the Ministry of National Education. So those 26 provinces are the provinces with the highest refugee concentration in Turkey, and in 500 schools in those provinces. So the exact number of, you see the exact number of students who participated in the program, slightly above 37,000, and more than half of those are refugees. So when I say refugees, so as you might know, there are refugees from many different nationalities in Turkey, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, Somalia, other places in Sudan. But a great majority of them are Syrian. So when I say refugees, I mostly mean Syrian refugees. So incidentally, in our sample, all refugees are Syrian. So I don't want to distinguish between the nationalities of the refugees. So those are, I'm going to talk about Syrian refugees. So the curriculum is prepared by the Ministry of National Education, and some support is also acquired from UNICEF. So around 2,000 Ministry of National Education teachers are assigned to this program on a voluntary basis, of course, and they are paid from the ministry budget. And there are also nutritious snacks provided to the kids, to the participating kids, to incentivize participation of disadvantaged kids, which is really important. Okay, so now let me talk about our experiment. So roughly speaking, our goal is to estimate the impact of in-class refugee concentration, or let's say interethnic exposure or contact, on outcomes of refugee and Turkish students. So this is a randomized field experiment, which is implemented as part of the summer school program. So the main goal of our design is to randomly allocate refugees to classrooms and in a way to obtain a balanced mix of classrooms with high, medium, and low refugee intensity. So, I mean, the main reason is obvious in the absence of such a random allocation. So if you want to estimate the impact of refugee intensity on the outcomes, I mean, you are gonna hit the endogeneity problem and things will become more and more complicated. All right, so the school, now our experimental design. So we chose Gaziantep as the province of implementation of our experiment. So it hosts a large refugee population. It's also a major implementation hub for the summer school program. So around 5,000 5-year-olds, around 50-50 refugee native ratio, were registered to the program in Gaziantep in more than 120 schools. So we initially picked 46 schools with almost 50% refugee concentration, and then we randomly selected 11 schools to implement our experiment. So 5 of those schools are located in Şehit Kamil, Şahin Bey, and 5 Şahin Bey, and 1 in Nizip. So those are among the towns in Gaziantep with the highest refugee concentration. So the program is advertised in refugee intensive areas by the outreach activities of the Ministry of National Education, and the families registered their kids to schools designated based on their home address. So there's this address-based school assignment as well. So the classroom level assignment, so in those 11 schools, students were randomly assigned to 36 groups before the program began. I did the randomization myself, and we prohibited the switching between groups and schools in our sample. And the group sizes vary between groups from 10 to 24. Well, school level conditions affected this variation. And we have an average size of 17 in our sample. And there is a balanced mix of classrooms with high, medium, and low refugee shares. We have some statistics in the paper. So for the students, a total of 638 students were in the initial allocation list. 12 students did not attend, 4 students dropped after the second week, and 18 students did not take the end of program assessment. So we had like 2 assessments, beginning of the program, end of program assessments. So in the overall, we had 604 students who completed the program, around 57%, 55% refugees versus 45 natives, balanced gender composition, and the attrition rate is around 5%, which we believe is ignorable. We also collected information about the number of siblings, parental education, both mother and father, parental employment, again, mother and father, and we also collected this information for both native and refugee students. We also collected information on social interaction variables, such as where the parents reside in refugee-intensive neighborhoods versus native-intensive neighborhoods, or whether parents' friends include any refugees or not. We also collected information about this. And for only refugee families, we collected region of origin in Syria, year of arrival in Turkey, and also Turkish language skills. So outcomes, as I mentioned, we collected it twice in the beginning and at the end of the program. So in line with the two major goals of the program, we chose three outcome variables. The first one is the Turkish language skills. So it is measured on a 6-category scale as instructed in the program, and the tests are performed by the teacher and reported by the teacher. And the friendship network, so students in the beginning and at the end of the program, students are asked to report their best friends, up to 5, in the classroom, and also rank them. And also pro-social behavior. So we also, similar to the first paper, we performed a version of the dictator game. We call this a sticker game. So which asks the number of stickers out of 10 the student owns that the student would share with her anonymous friend in the classroom. Okay, so this is the empirical strategy. So we have two main equations. The first one is on the left-hand side, the end of program outcome, and the control variables are the refugee share in the classroom, the outcome measured at the baseline, and also the two vector of controls. One is children level characteristics, and the second is parent-specific controls. So this is the linear specification, linear in the refugee share. So to capture possible nonlinearities, we included terciles of the refugee share in our sample. So it is indicated by this T variable. So, and the first category is omitted, of course. So we include the other two categories. So we use the tercile specification to capture nonlinearities. So this is the results for the sticker game for the entire sample. As you see, so as the refugee share goes up, the number of stickers shared with the friend goes down. And so this is the results are even stronger for the nonlinear specification. By the way, we go from left to the right by adding additional controls, and we say that column 5 is our preferred specification. So the negative relationship is even more apparent in the nonlinear specification. So when we do separate regressions for Turkish and Syrian kids, we see that almost all of the effect, actually all of this negative effect, comes from Turkish kids. So Turkish kids share less stickers as the random refugee concentration in the classroom goes up. And again, this is really large for the nonlinear specification. So when we compare the mean outcome, this corresponds to around a 45% increase relative to the average, which is quite sizable impact. And also when we look at Syrian kids, well, our interpretation is that there is some statistically significant coefficients, but it is rather weak. But if anything, so as you see, again, the signs are negative, but remember that the variable is defined as the refugee concentration. So this is just you should interpret the signs as the opposite of the Turkish case. So this means that refugees tend to share more. So if you interpret this evidence as statistically significant, it means that refugees tend to share more as refugee concentration goes down. Turkish concentration goes up in the classroom. Right, so we interpret these findings as Turkish children share less in high refugee groups when the expected recipient is a Syrian kid in the class than they do in low refugee groups where the expected recipient is a Turkish kid. So this is sort of indicative of a tendency for in-group favoritism. That's what we tend to interpret this finding as. And for Syrians, of course, there's a weaker tendency for in-group favoritism. So this is consistent with the previous evidence that this tendency is always stronger for the high status group, so which is also the Turkish kids in this setting. So this is the friendship regressions. So this is for Turkish kids. So this is the number of Syrian friends. So, I mean, we interpret this finding as that refugee share does not affect the number of Syrian friends for Turkish kids. I mean, we see some, when we look at this fifth column, we see some, 10 percentage point statistical significance for the linear specification, nothing for the nonlinear specification, but this is really economically insignificant. So this is really small. So we interpret this finding as the refugee concentration goes up, Turkish kids do not make more Syrian friends. So when we look at the Syrian kids, it's just the opposite. As the Turkish kid concentration in the classroom goes up, refugees tend to make more Turkish friends. So, I mean, these are self-reported friends, of course. I mean, and that's how Syrian kids report their friendship preferences. So this is also consistent with the results of the sticker game that Syrians tend to favor the out-group rather than in-group favoritism. And finally, the language improvement results. This is for Syrian kids, of course. We do not see, first of all, I want to mention that we see a very significant language improvement when we compare the beginning and end of the programs for all Syrian kids in the program. But this improvement is not a function of refugee concentration. So if there were relevant social interactions between Turkish and Syrian kids in the school, we would expect to have a positive impact of increased Turkish kid concentration on the language skills of Syrian kids. But we do not see it here. So language improvements are not a function of refugee concentration or Turkish kid concentration in the classroom. So which also confirms the other two findings, that the quality of interactions, the social cohesion, etc., is not high quality enough to generate this improvement in the language skills. So these are just, we just examine here some, of course we do it more in the paper, but this is just one example. So we just performed the regression based on neighborhood composition and parental background. So the first one is two separate regressions based on, Turkey. So this is for Turkish kids, by the way, only for Turkish kids. So this is segregated neighborhoods, column 1, column 2, mixed neighborhoods. As you see, the decline in the sticker sharing tendency comes mostly from the kids, Turkish kids, residing in segregated neighborhoods. And secondly, when we look at the parental background regressions, regressions condition on parental background, we also see that almost all of the decline comes from Turkish kids with lower educated mothers. So this provides some hint about the potential mechanisms that we could dig. We plan to do further exercises in conjunction with the results of our theoretical models, but this is some initial picture about the potential mechanisms in the background. So let me summarize the findings. So Turkish kids are more likely to share a given endowment with a random classmate when in-class refugee concentration is low. So we interpret this as an evidence of in-group favoritism in pro-social behavior, while Syrian kids do not discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. So if anything, there is weak evidence of favoring the out-group. So secondly, we find increased exposure to children of the other ethnicity leads to some increase in the formation of interethnic friendships for Syrian kids, while this is not the case for Turkish kids. And finally, we find a significant improvement of the Turkish language skills for all Syrian kids in the program, in our sample, but this is not a function of the in-class refugee concentration. So, let me, in the remaining 3 minutes, let me try to interpret this. Well, our literature review is also not complete yet, so because the paper is constantly enlarging and we are having difficulty in keeping up with the literature review. So, so the first one is the contact hypothesis. So there's a booming literature testing the contact hypothesis in educational setting, and most of those papers provide strong evidence that contact eliminates prejudice. So our paper can be positioned in this literature, first of all. So there are various papers, as you see. I mean, you know probably very well these papers. Some of them are work in progress, but they are forthcoming in very good journals. And those are mostly mostly natural experiments performed in higher education settings. I mean, ranging from high school to masters and also military service, etc. So our setting differs from those papers in 3 ways. First of all, our sample consists of preschool kids of age 5, which is not explored in this literature. Second, so the contact happens between refugees and native kids. That's also another novelty in our paper. And finally, we do a randomized field experiment rather than a natural experiment. So to our knowledge, our paper is among the first papers showing that contact may lead to worse intergroup outcomes in education settings, at least for the high status group for preschool kids. We also show that the impact of contact on prejudice may be different between the majority and minority groups. And so this suggests that contact alone does not guarantee improved intergroup outcomes between refugee and native students. This actually supports, I mean, this says that social cohesion is important. The current educational setting lacks social cohesion elements, and also it justifies why we need, you know, policies or interventions to improve social cohesion. So this also supports the other papers' findings. I mean, the Shule Alan and co-authors papers. And we need that type of studies and interventions to support this element. So there's also a result about prosociality. So there is a lot of evidence that early childhood is an important time for social preference development, and it is also formative for social preferences for adolescence and adulthood. So as you know very well, prosociality is widely accepted as a component of non-cognitive skills and affecting any behavioral and socioeconomic outcomes. So we also contribute to this literature by documenting that the Turkish children exhibit in-group favoritism and are less willing to develop inter-ethnic friendships, and so on and so forth. And finally, I mean, I want to mention this because most of the papers in the literature, I mean, measuring the impact of refugees on host country educational outcomes use an indirect approach. I mean, this is mostly because of, so that's not a choice. So that's a, you know, natural outcome of data availability. But I mean, most of the papers use an indirect approach. There is mostly no refugee data, and there's an indirect, you know, analysis of the potential impact of refugee concentration across regions on the outcomes of interest. So microdata on refugees are typically confidential, but there are a set of studies directly using administrative refugee data. So I have 2 papers in progress. I'm going to present one of them next week or two weeks from now in the World Bank Migration Conference. And there are also other papers collecting data in experimental settings, which are also recently becoming available. And I think this is going to increase a lot in the coming couple of years. And this paper can be listed among the second group, I mean, this microdata on refugees group. I think that the focus of the literature will probably eventually shift from this indirect approach toward this more direct approach. So now, finally, let me talk about our ongoing work. So, sorry, 20 seconds.
Okay, sure.
The theory part is, it's going to be a model of, it's actually, so the model is there. It's a model of network formation, which is consistent with empirical design, and which aims to explain the empirical patterns that we have, this asymmetry between majority and minority groups. And we also explore the potential theoretical mechanisms at work, and we are testing those potential mechanisms. And in the structural estimation part, we are estimating the main parameters of the model. And we also perform various policy experiments using those estimates, such as what are the optimal class size, what should be the composition of refugees in the classroom to minimize the social, to maximize social cohesion, etc., etc. So there are many other policy experiments that can be performed, which is in progress. This is the end of advertisement. Thank you very much for listening. Great,
thank you very much for the presentation. We have Salma Musa joining us from California. It's from about, I think it's 7:30 a.m. Salma, good morning and thanks for joining us. You have 10 minutes for your discussion. The floor is yours.
Great. First, thanks for inviting me as an undercover political scientist and Egyptian. I feel very proud to have infiltrated this conference, and more importantly, for letting me discuss this fantastic paper. Firstly, I really cannot overstate how impressive this actual project is. To be able to have this kind of collaboration with the government and with the education system and run this kind of randomized trial is just incredibly impressive. So I really want to just commend the authors for being able to pull this off. So more substantively on the paper, I'll start with my substantive comments, and the more minor points I'm happy to send to the authors later. So first, I think you should, since you're speaking to the contact hypothesis, two things on this. First is, what is the nature and quality of the contact in this experiment and also before this experiment? So just the baseline level of contact. So you say on page 4, contact is non-random. So flesh this out, like what do interactions look like outside of this intervention? Are these kids meeting in school? Are they meeting in the neighborhood? Are they neighbors? So what does this intervention represent relative to what their intergroup exposure looks like otherwise? I would also say that it's really worth outlining what are the 4 conditions that contact is supposedly the ideal conditions for contact to reduce prejudice, and map them out onto the dynamics of this intervention. So do you have equal status? Do you have the endorsement of communal authorities, et cetera, et cetera? This will let us understand really like what should our expectations be when we have this mixed result. Is that because the type of contact itself was like suboptimal contact, or is it actually because contact doesn't work? So that would be a really helpful discussion for helping us situate the findings. I think also on literature, one of the main contributions of this paper is really to look at contact on a continuous scale. This is something that's just starting to be explored, and I'm happy to share some references with you. But so I think it's really important to be upfront about how these categories of low, medium, high were chosen and relate them actually to this equal status criterion. So if contact is supposed to work best when there's equal power status, some people interpret that as being 50-50. Other papers have found like there's this really nonlinear effect of the group composition that affects minorities and majorities differently. So I would really engage with that more and make it really clear what the theoretic contribution is. On the mixed results, so there seems to be this trend that's coming out, or like a pattern of results from post-conflict settings, showing that contact in general is less effective, or at least more nuanced in those kinds of fragile settings. And so in a way, this paper, I think, relates more to that body of work, which again, it's only a handful of papers, but it suggests that something about these post-conflict or fragile environments makes conflict much less effective. And the effects tend to be concentrated among behaviors rather than attitudes and some other quirks. So I wonder, to what extent do you consider this to be a post-conflict setting? And does that kind of macro political environment, how is that shaping the outcomes of contact here? I think taking several end-line measures is really smart. I wonder how similar are the T2 and T3, so those 2 end lines for students who took both. How similar are their responses across both? And more importantly, can you actually use this as a measure of short-term versus longer-term effects? This would be another big contribution on the empirical side, is teaching us something about how these effects decay over time. And that's something that I think is very underexplored in the contact literature. Language, I thought it's a really interesting outcome. I know the other paper that you mentioned also looks at language, and I think this is very cool. My question is language needed for friendship? So is language kind of mechanistically related to the friendship and social networks outcome? So do you have some qualitative evidence on language and more generally that shows us how language operates and how these kids are interacting in the classroom? One way to do this is to also look at subgroup effects by language, as well as providing qualitative evidence. And I would also link this back to, and I can send you references on this, the literature on contact, especially among children, specifically, it really focuses on friendship potential. Like the contact needs to be set up in a way where kids can become friends for these effects to be unlocked. So is language kind of a key to accessing that friendship potential, which itself is needed for contact to translate into tolerance? I also thought, since you look at this kind of two-sided integration for Turks and for Syrians, and you break out the analyses for Syrians and for Turks, which I think makes a lot of sense. My question is, maybe the authors can actually answer this really quickly. If the treatment, let's say, is a high share of refugees in the class, do you define that in the same way for Turks and for Syrians? So high share, right? So I think you actually need to flip this. So from the Syrian kids' perspective, a high share of intergroup contact would mean being in a class where the Turks are the majority. So I think, yeah, this is key. So in a classroom that has a high share of refugee kids, from the perspective of the refugee kids, they're not engaging in a lot of, it's actually a low intergroup contact condition for them. But for the Turks, it's a high intergroup contact condition.
Yeah, but the coefficient is just 1 minus the coefficient. I just,
okay, so you factored this in.
Yeah, I
okay.
tried this. So I tried this. I'm sure that this is just a matter of, representation. That's it.
Sure, but yeah, I think this would, just to make this very easy to interpret, I would just scale these in the correct direction for, yeah. And so that's kind of on the empirical side, but more generally, the prejudice dynamics are probably different, right, for minorities and majorities. There's some work on this, not a lot, and the work that we do have suggests that contact is much less effective for minority group members in general. Like they're more skeptical of contact, it doesn't really work among them. For mainstream members or majority group members, especially when the conflict is not that salient to them, it's much easier to move them as opposed to members of the minority. So like you would expect larger results for Turks in this case, but not on Syrians. So this is just something really to explore, and I think it could be a big contribution of this paper. So the literature would lead to this expectation that the results would be less pronounced for Syrians, and for Turks, you would expect that there's some non-linearity potentially. Like up until 50%, you would expect positive results, but then once Syrians become the majority, it goes down the other way. Like some people have called this Ortefeu effect. So like once when you start feeling like there are too many of someone from a minority group, you start to panic and it induces racial anxiety. So this is just to say there's some expectations from the literature, which I'm happy to point you to, but I think some discussion of how these dynamics are different based on your minority status. So in terms of the prejudice itself and also how contact should operate would be very helpful. And my last substantive comment is also on this question of like, how do the proportions of refugees, how does this affect the two groups differently? So on page 20, you say, the higher the share of Syrian children in the group, the less likely a Syrian child is to form a relationship with a Turkish kid. So this might be totally understandable if there are just mechanistically fewer Turkish kids, right? There's like fewer of them to befriend. Like you don't have as much of an option in who your friends are. Like if you have a class with lots of Turkish kids, like you're just mechanistically going to have more Turkish friends potentially just in terms of absolute numbers. So maybe there's some way to normalize this like friendship outcome by the total number of outgroup kids in the class. And I wonder, like, are the kids kind of substitutes when it comes to friends? And this goes back to the language thing. So like, is it as easy to become friends with a Turkish kid as with a Syrian kid? Or like just tell us a little bit more qualitatively about what those friendship dynamics look like. Some minor points, which I won't go into a lot of discussion, but just in general to clarify the comparison being made. Maybe this is from a non-economist's eye, but I think to be very clear about like when you say things like we find a significant improvement in Turkish skills for children across all groups, but this improvement is not a function of in-class refugee concentration. So a statement like that, like, is this a difference in difference? Is it over time? Is this an experimental result? Is this just from the baseline? So just make it explicit, like what type of comparison is being made. And then how do you handle baseline data? Do you control for it, or do you actually just use it as a control, or is your outcome like do you actually subtract the end line and baseline as the outcome? And then throughout, you talk about Syrian refugees specifically, and like this is a contribution to the literature on Syrian refugees. I agree with you, like Syrian refugees are distinctive in many ways, but I think we need a bit more of a theoretically driven understanding of why should we think about Syrian refugees as opposed to literature on refugee native integration more generally. There's obviously a massive lack of causal evidence in general, but like, is there something about the Syrian refugee that should make us think differently? And my last 2 points, I think your discussion on Syrian refugees in the education system, you can cut this down to just focus on the 3rd period, which is relevant for your study. And lastly, on page 10, you talk about selection. It would be good to understand how many kids were eligible for this program overall, so we can understand like these numbers of those who actually signed up and understand the selection process. But again, I really just want to stress that this is a huge achievement. I'm really impressed that you guys pulled this off. And with some work, I think this paper can be a really major contribution to the contact literature.
Salma, thank you very much. Really appreciate it for you taking the time to make the discussion. So Semi, do you want to take just a couple of minutes to quickly react to Salma's comments, because we also have some questions pending?
Sure, thank you very much, Salma, for the wonderful comments. So I will surely send you an email to get the full set of comments. So I just tried to took notes for the major points. I agree with almost all of the points, and thanks very much for the suggestions. A few points. Well, is language needed for friendship? Well, based on observation, of course, I can say that an age 5 kid can be friends immediately with a stone or a tree, right? So, it should be easier to make friends, even more easier to make friends, even among kids speaking different languages. So, but I agree that there's something specific about this age group, because friendship at age 5 is not the same as friendship at age, let's say, 18, right? So the criteria is different. So the type of friendship, games, everything is different. Yeah, I agree that a specific discussion has to be made about this if language is needed. But our purpose about the language improvement is to test whether, this program makes the kids more prepared for primary school, the 1st grade, and whether this is a function of this refugee concentration in the classroom or not. So this is for design purposes for the implementation of preschool, these mixed preschool programs in the coming years. So I agree the interpretation of the science, but believe me that the Syrian, when I put Turkish concentration in the regression, the coefficient is just 1 minus the coefficient of the current version in the current version of the paper. So just not to confuse the reader why the definition of the outcome, the main independent variable is changing. We prefer to keep it in its current form in the paper, but I agree that we need to explain it more. So yes, prejudice dynamics in different groups, excellent comment. Why Syrian refugees? So I think that, well, we should not advertise this as a general refugee paper, because, every refugee case is different, right? Syrian refugees in Turkey is potentially a different, it's a different case than Syrian refugees in, let's say, Lebanon, probably, right? And there are Russian refugees in Israel, French refugees in Angola, in Algeria, sorry, and there are many other cases in the world. There are many other papers. So I think each refugee case is different. So we need to be careful in framing the contribution of the paper in this literature. But I agree. So it should be, more generally integrated in the refugee literature. For eligibility, so this question make me think of something different. So I agree that the sample is mostly consisting of kids coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, right? So in that sense, our estimates should be interpreted as late. So like local average treatment effects, because the sample is, disadvantaged Turkish and Syrian kids who did not take any form of early childhood education before. So those are coming from families with lower backgrounds. So we need to be careful also interpreting these estimates. So thank you very much. So these are my major responses. We can
Great, thank you.
move to other questions.
Great, thanks. So we have Mevlüt Akbulut. Mevlüt has a question. Mevlüt, go ahead, please. Mevlüt, please unmute yourself.
Thank you for the great presentation. I learned a lot. I didn't know that program existed in Turkey. I have two questions. So one is, as you mentioned, you did a randomized experiment. So I was rather wondering why you have all these controls if it is randomized and non-linearity as well. So if it is truly randomized, they should have the same balance test. That's the first question. So I have three. The second question is, I have 5-year-olds, so and how I know exactly how they interact. And again, we are in a place where there are lots of different kids. So I'm wondering how your results will change when you use, rather than like a gender ratio. So they really want, I have sons, they want to play with boys. So I want to see how your results will change using the gender ratio in a class in addition or rather than the refugee. It really matters, the gender matters the most at this age. And my third question is also the language. So how, because I mean, you make kind of interpret your questions in a strong way, I find a little bit. So how we can say 5-year-old have a favoritism, I'm not very sure on that. So I will, I mean, it might be the case when they're older. So I am wondering how you can disentangle the effect of the language and, as the discussant said, the class size, like number of kids in the class, and the favoritism part of the story. That will be my questions. Thank you so much.
Should I respond now?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the questions. So randomized and controlled. So this is not an absolute randomization. So it's not like we have a sample, we have access to the whole sample and we randomize everything from that big sample. So we were able to make a local randomization, right? So these are also, schools coming from selected neighborhoods, and there are differences across schools in terms of parental background, etc. So we randomize exposure to refugee kids within the classrooms, right? But I mean, we are not sure whether, so those differences are, there are interactions between parental background, etc. So I agree in the sense that we do not have a lot of change in the coefficients after we include the controls, but we try to make sure that that partial randomization did not contaminate our results. So this gender ratio question is very interesting. Actually, we started doing the same thing with the gender ratio and also controlling for both gender ratio and refugee ratio. Things became really complicated, and we, left that part for future research, or a research project that would never end. I don't know. So I agree. That's a very interesting point. But I can say that after controlling for the gender coefficients, so as far as I remember, the qualitative nature of our results did not change. And most of the gender ratio coefficients were insignificant, right? So that was why as far as I remember, so this was like 4 months ago, that was why we decided not to proceed with including gender ratios. For language, well, we have these initial measurements, right? So, and that's also controlled in the regressions. So I think, so this is just like beginning and end type of comparison. So I think, I don't know if I understood your question correctly. You say that, well, whether the language skill is contaminating the impact of the sticker game, etc. But I mean, that type of initial language knowledge effects are, in my understanding, is washed away in our regression specification. So, but I'm gonna consider this point deeper. I think it's a valid point. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. So Aydoğan Ülker has a question. Aydoğan is joining us from Australia.
This is Aydoğan joining from Melbourne, Australia. My concern was more about the outside the classroom baseline exposure and also interclass interaction. So to what extent these classrooms interact with each other and all that, and what can you tell us about that?
So I couldn't get part of the question. So to what extent these kids?
Initially, what's the baseline exposure outside the classroom, and also what's the extent of interclass interactions when you define these medium, high, and low class exposure? But during the period of your experiments, to what extent these classrooms interact with each other and all that?
Well, for baseline exposure, so this, I don't have, data on this, but I can say based on, anecdotal evidence that, Syrian families live in, this closed, rather segregated neighborhoods. So the baseline interaction is that Syrian kids interact with each other in their neighborhoods. So in the baseline, there is no interethnic exposure for, I mean, if there is any, it is minimal, especially in our sample, because this is coming from disadvantaged backgrounds living in segregated neighborhoods. Interclass interactions, I think this is interesting. Some of our teachers told us, and also Shule Hoca, I remember, she gave references to interclass interactions in one of her presentations. Well, Syrian and Turkish kids most of the time prefer to interact with Syrian and Turkish kids in other classrooms. Rather than mixing in their own class, they do this type of interclass interactions. I mean, we did not intervene in that, right? So we say that if they spend enough time in their classroom, they should be able to, mingle and, mix, increase their interactions. But for some reason, there is also interclass interactions for the same ethnicity kids. So this is what I can say based on anecdotal evidence.
Thanks. So we have one last question from Seyit Gilasun. Seyit.
Okay. Thank you, Sami, for this great presentation. Maybe you mentioned, but I miss it. In your language regressions, instead of using Syrian refugee population ratio, would it be better to use share of Turkish friends as an indicator of interaction?
Well, so intuitively, so I asked this question myself before I ran the regressions, and I said, okay, intuitively, the sign of that alternative regression should be just the magnitude should be the same, the sign should be different. And then I couldn't be sure, and I tried. I can assure you that those are the same regressions. And the coefficient is just one minus the other one. So it doesn't matter.
Great. Thank you very much, Sami, for the great presentation. Salma, thank you very much for this great discussion. We will now take about a 5 minutes break, and we will resume with the second session of the day. See you very soon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is going to be the second session of today on political economy of violence. So as I said in the introduction, our purpose when we started this workshop was really to focus on good research, but also focus on those issues that are the most pressing for the country. And I think the previous session was a nice example of that with the topic of how to integrate refugee kids through educational means. And I think this session is also a good example of that, with two of the most pressing problems, one on the one side with the intimate partner violence, and on the other side with the political violence. So we are going to have two papers in this session, and both of them are going to try to look at the economic shocks, and they're going to try to figure out how these economic shocks actually shape different types of violence. And we are going to first give the stage to Bilge for her to speak about her work on the intimate partner violence. So Bilge, you have half an hour and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Orkun. It's a great pleasure to be here and attend this really interesting workshop. So you can see my screen, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so perfect. So today I'm going to talk about female employment and intimate partner violence, looking at the refugee inflows into Turkey from Syria. And this is joint work with Pınar Keskin, who is assistant professor at Wellesley College. So as you know, violence against women is a worldwide problem that is very, very heavily widespread. So there is not actually one part of the world that is insulated from this issue. Even when you look at high-income countries, you can see that there's the prevalence, lifetime prevalence of experiencing domestic violence is about 23%. And when we look at the specific case of Turkey, which World Health Organization categorizes under the European region, is higher than the average of the European regions, where the European region has 25% prevalence, whereas Turkey has, for physical violence, about 35% lifetime prevalence. The annual rate of experiencing violence is about 10%. And when we look at sexual violence, it's about 13% lifetime prevalence. And when we look at psychological violence, narrowly defined, such as humiliation, threatening, scaring, that is about 41%. So we are talking about, in general, a context where violence against women within the household is relatively high. So what is the problem with that? Obviously, so many problems on so many different levels. One issue is that these women experience violent relationships, are also experiencing so many other issues, including mental health problems, alcohol and substance abuse, absence from work that leads to productivity losses, but also sexually transmitted diseases and unintended pregnancies. Also, children born in violent households are experiencing lower birth weights. They have trouble in cognitive ability and also socio-cognitive abilities, trying to interact with other kids. And in addition, there's also spillover effects to the peers within the same classroom. There's also quasi-experimental evidence showing that even if your kid is not exposed to violence, just being in a classroom with other kids who are exposed to such violent home environments actually has negative effects on your own child. So this is obviously a very important issue, and generally, empowerment of women is often thought as a major tool against reducing intimate partner violence. But when we look at the channels through which this can happen, there are actually two different ways in which this can happen. The optimistic scenario is the bargaining theory, which predicts that when we empower women economically, through increasing their access to resources, either through employment or welfare programs, transfers, that increases their outside options and bargaining power, and that tends to then reduce their exposure to violence because they have an exit option. So there is widespread evidence of this in advanced countries where we know the bargaining power of women and the outside options are relatively higher and more improved. Weak evidence from developed countries as well. When we look at the other side of the coin, which is the instrumental theories of violence, the prediction is actually reversed. There, the prediction is that an increase in resources available to women might actually strengthen the incentives of men to try to use violence as a means of controlling women and also gaining access to these newly obtained resources. And there is evidence of this from India, from Mexico, from Turkey, from other developing countries. In fact, this is, as these types of studies are now widely being implemented, there's more RCTs related to this these days. You see actually that there's more evidence of the instrumental theories of violence, particularly in contexts where even giving resources to women does not necessarily empower them enough to be able to create a credible outside option. Now, when we look at our study, so we are going to particularly look at the employment channel in the study. We looked at education in a different paper, but in this context, we're going to consider employment and the effect of employment on IPV. Here, when we look at many studies, actually do not control for omitted variable bias or reverse causality. And so they generally document a descriptive relationship. There are studies from the US and from UK that look at relative labor market conditions. And they generally find evidence for bargaining channel in the sense that when women's economic opportunities improve, violence declines. So we are contributing to this literature looking at the case of Turkey, where from our previous study, we know that that channel does not always work, but we want to also see this within the context of employment as to see what happens if women's employment opportunities change. How does that affect their risk of experiencing domestic violence? So we're going to look at this within the context of Syrian refugee inflows. As you know, there was a large influx of Syrian refugees to Turkey, and there are many studies now looking at the labor market effects. And what they find in general, that there might be actually differential effects by gender. In particular, while most of the studies find strong negative effects on the informal employment of men, overall, in fact, there is also evidence that actually formal employment of men also increased, and the net effect generally for men seems to be not that high compared to women. We also think this is important because Syrian refugees until 2016 were actually overwhelmingly employed informally because they were not issued work permits until 2016. And we are going to look at the effects from 2008 to 2014, where we have information on domestic violence. And we think that this is really important because women being very concentrated, women's employment being very concentrated on informal sectors, this can have really gendered effects in terms of the labor market. Now we are going to look at this using an instrumental variable strategy because we know that there can be potential endogeneity of refugee inflows into Turkish provinces. And we are going to use an instrument based on, which is a weighted travel distance between 13 governorates in Syria and 81 Turkish provinces. And we are going to also look at this, for robustness, considering language-based instrument based on intensity of Arabic speakers. And overall, we are going to also do a number of robustness checks to see whether the results are actually robust to various drivers of this. And we will show that this, in fact, seems not to be driven by pretrans and not to be driven by border provinces or very large provinces. Okay, as a preview, we find actually big negative impacts. I mean, not very big, but sort of very significant and robust effects on female employment in the sense that refugees seems to displace more female workers than male workers. And in addition, we also find a decline in intimate partner violence in places that received a high share of refugees. This is consistent with instrumental theories of violence in the sense that a decline in women's earning opportunities actually reduces the incentives of men to use violence as a means of controlling household decision-making and potentially controlling the rent extraction from women. We also look at various alternative channels, such as marriage market channel, the gender attitudes, partner characteristics, and a number of other factors, and we don't find any evidence of those in this context. So let me talk a little bit more about the background. As you know, there was a large influx of Syrian refugees, so we're going to be looking at, before the refugee crisis, 2008, comparing that to 2014, so a few years into the refugee influx. And as I said, the Turkish government actually did not give a formal work permit to refugees until 2016, but they were given this temporary protection status, which meant that they could stay, they were not forced to return, and they had access to rights and services such as education, health, freedom of movement within Turkey. But most of them essentially worked in the informal sector because of this issue. And a lot of them were actually living outside of the camps, about 85%. So the camps were not the primary destination where they located. So this is sort of the share of refugees as a share of the province population. And you can see that the eastern sections and also bigger provinces such as Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, they received large refugee inflows. But when they're asked to Syrian refugees, what was the important consideration in terms of where you settled, 80% of them said that the travel costs was a very important consideration in terms of where they settled. So we have two sets of data. We're going to combine the refugee data that comes from UNHCR and the Turkish Migration Authority. And one issue that I will note is that there can be significant measurement error in terms of the share of refugees, because we know where they registered, but we don't know where they moved after they registered. So this can cause attenuation bias in the estimates. In terms of domestic violence data, we have 2 rounds of domestic violence against women, national surveys. These are surveys that target 15 to 59-year-old women, national representative, and they were very confidentially conducted and super detailed in terms of the different dimensions of violence, but also when violence happened. We are going to focus on the last 12 months to be able to see how the exposure to refugees affects their experience of violence within the last year, and a number of other related outcomes. We also look at labor force surveys and demographic health surveys for additional analysis. So very briefly, so we have a number of employment outcomes and for both men and women, and you can see, having worked last week is only 18% in our sample. So it's a low labor force participation environment compared to men, which was 77%. And educational levels are not particularly high, 6.6 years of education on average. And most women work in the service sector, but also some in agriculture. When we look at gender attitudes, you can also see that 21% of women actually find it acceptable that men beat their partners in certain situations. We also have information about whether the husband has a second wife, which we also think can be an important channel if Syrian refugees marry in with the natives. So we will test for that. And we also can document whether the co-residence patterns with the parent-in-law changed or not. So we will look at that too. So in terms of empirical strategy, I already mentioned that the refugee inflows can be an endogenous decision. So refugees might go into places where the labor market outcomes are improving over time to be able to find better jobs, or actually they might select into low wage regions where maybe the labor market outcomes are not expanding very high, but also cost of living is also low. So the direction of bias is not obvious in this case. In addition, I already mentioned there can be attenuation bias because of the measurement error in the refugee share. So we will use the IV strategy to address these issues. So the specification, we're going to have the outcome variable that can be a domestic violence outcome, labor market outcome, regressed on the refugee share at the province level, and we will compare 2008 to 2014 at the province level, also accounting for individual level controls, province level time varying controls such as trade volume in each province with Syria, and also the baseline trade volume to account for baseline connections between different governance of Syria and the different regions of Turkey, because obviously the Syrian civil war might have effects other than just affecting the labor market directly. So we have province fixed effects and year fixed effects. That means that essentially we are comparing provinces across time, within a province across time. And we will cluster standard errors to account for serial correlation within a province. So the instrument is a weighted travel distance that has been previously used in the literature. So it's essentially the inverse of the travel distance between a province and the Syrian governorate, weighted by the Syrian population in each governorate. The idea being that if refugees come from a very populous governorate, then that should be weighted at a higher proportion. And also we have the total number of refugees registered in a given year. So in terms of primary results, what we can see in the first stage is that this is a pretty good predictor of where refugees end up. The F statistics is very high, and also adding various controls, it doesn't really change all that much. And if we were to use a language-based instrument, we also get a very strong first stage. In terms of labor market outcomes, we find this reduction. So if we look at just IV first, we find that in regions that receive the high refugee inflows predicted by the instrument, we find a reduction in women's probability of employment. And the effect is about one standard deviation increase in the refugee share, which is about 2 percentage points, leads to a 1.4 percentage point decline in female employment, which is about 8% relative to the mean. So we are not talking about like an extremely large effect, but this is a very robust, significant effect. Also, this leads to a reduction in the probability of having a personal income. And for men, for the husbands, we can see that we find no significant effects documented. So this is just from the domestic violence survey. We have the robustness. If anybody is interested, I'm happy to show those. I will show the household labor force surveys evidence in a second too. But before I move to that, a concern is that maybe because refugees are now very highly present in the labor market, maybe they don't displace women, but their husbands actually don't let them work because there's just so many refugee men, or for example, in the labor market that they have to interact with. So we test for that possibility, and actually we find no evidence that women were forced to drop out of the labor market through their husband. This is the labor force survey, obviously much bigger sample, and we do two different exercises here. We first just pick the years, the same in the domestic violence survey 2008, 2014, and we find very similar result, negative effect on women's labor market outcomes. And you see not just for employment, but also earnings and hours worked. And also for men, you see that we find no significant effects for men and much smaller coefficients. When we pool the 2006 and 2014, actually we find exactly the same results. So results don't change at all. The domestic violence indices, I haven't talked about it yet. So it's essentially a Z-score that is composed of all of the underlying indicators, the average, the simple average of the standardized indicators. So things like slapping, pushing, kicking, choking, burning, etc. We take an average of that just but focusing on last 12 months. We do the same for sexual violence and psychological violence. And essentially higher values indicate higher intimate partner violence. And the reason for using these indices is that it actually aggregates information from different dimensions that allows us to actually get more statistical power to capture violent behavior. And so these are the results that we find. Okay, one thing I didn't say about OLS and IV, you saw that the coefficients are quite similar for the labor market and the same for the domestic violence. And what that says is, in fact, the type of endogenous sorting that we might be worried about is actually fairly limited in this context. And we get a sense of that also when we exclude, for example, highly populous labor markets, like big expanding labor markets like Istanbul or Ankara, Izmir. We find very similar results. And also when we exclude just the border area, we find also significant results. So it's not just driven by a particular region, workers selecting into certain areas. And for domestic violence, we find also a significant effect. So it's, again, not a very large effect, about 4 percentage point decline in the index, but it is a very robust result. In terms of education, so we do find that effects are more concentrated in the less educated groups. So when you look at women with education of less than 8 years, you find that their employment declined more, their personal income declined more in the regions that received high refugee inflows compared to regions that received less. But their husband's work probability did not change. But again, for those less educated women, we find the big decline, I mean, not the big, so sorry, a significant decline in the risk of experiencing violence across all dimensions, physical, sexual, and psychological violence. So there are, of course, many alternative channels in which there can be effects of this treatment. So one is, for example, refugees might have different gender attitudes than natives, and having increased cultural contact can result in a greater diffusion of these attitudes. And we find no evidence of that. There can be also marriage market effects, right? So refugees can be potential partners, and this can lead to changes in assortative mating. If Turkish men can marry refugee women very easily, then this can, maybe negatively affect the bargaining power of Turkish women. And actually, we find no evidence of that. Another channel, as Professor Tümen has documented, there has been these effects on the rental market. Refugees might actually drive up the rental prices because they seek the rental housing. And this can actually lead to changes in cohabitation. Maybe now they're more willing to live with their mother-in-law, father-in-law, and whose parents they live with can also affect their risk of domestic violence. And testing this, we actually found no evidence of this. Another important channel could be that displaced women who are now at home, they might actually spend more time on household work. And this can then lead to increased satisfaction, and this can make men less violent. In fact, this was one of the issues we thought is really important. So we looked at this issue, looking at the domestic, the DHS data, demographic and health survey data. And we found actually no evidence of this. We have a chores index. We look at many different chores, and we find no evidence of this potential channel. Also, we can look at, and using an event study for the labor market outcomes, whether there's the differential trends that already existed before refugees arrived, and whether actually we are just picking up on those differential trends. And when we do that kind of placebo check, actually we find no evidence. In fact, what we see is that I'm not going to show just for the interest of time, but we see that there are parallel trend, there's no effect before, and then in fact, only for women, there's a decline in labor market outcomes, employment, but for men, we find that the coefficient just stays very close to 0. So to conclude, we just essentially look at this differential arrival of Syrian refugee inflows across different Turkish provinces, looking at the Syrian civil war, which is exogenous for our purposes, as a labor supply shock. But given that, although the event is exogenous, still the refugees might sort endogenously, so we use the instrumental variable strategy. We find that the Syrian refugee inflows had a negative effect on labor market outcomes of women in places that differentially received more refugees compared to those that received less. And we don't find any evidence that this had a significant effect on male labor market outcomes. Again, I want to highlight that informal sector men might be negatively affected. There's evidence of this, very clear evidence. What we're saying is that in total, actually these effects can be really small, because as documented in the labor literature, this is nothing new, is that there can be actually positive effects of men being more employed in the formal sectors. So in net, actually the two seems to cancel each other. But we find, maybe somewhat surprising, if you believed in the bargaining theory, that would be surprising that there's a reduction in intimate partner violence. So why could that be happening? We think that a major reason why that can be happening is that a reduction in women's employment opportunities, in fact, reduce the incentives of men for using violence or threats of violence as a means of. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion as well as the questions.
Thank you very much, Bilge. Interesting presentation. So we are going to have Berkay, who's going to discuss the paper within 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. I'll just share my screen just a second. Sorry. For some reason, this is a new computer is asking me some additional security measures. Oops. Yeah, now. Okay. Can everyone see me and my screen?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for having me here for this conference, and as well as giving me the chance to read this great paper. It's quite exciting to be participating in the second year of this LSE workshop. It was a great pleasure. And you have just listened to the paper, so I'm not going to talk much about what it like summarizing research questions. I just want to come directly to the main points I basically am interested in discussing. But quickly, the idea is I might be simplifying too much if like in giving the summary of the question. I highly recommend you go and read the paper. There's a working paper out available in the author's websites. So the question is basically about whether the changes in female employment affect intimate partner violence. Although the question is formulated as whether Syrian mass migration is affecting intimate partner violence, the bulk of the paper's discussion is about the channel through which female employment goes through the intimate partner violence, which is in line with the hypothesis that a decrease in the women's relative power within the household reduces intimate partner violence because it takes away the reason for men to exert power within the relationship for various outcomes, and when the power balance shifts with a reduction in the female employment. So the paper uses the exogenous source of variation in female employment, which is produced by an aggregate labor supply shock due to mass Syrian refugee influx. I think aggregate is italic here for a purpose because we are not really looking at the true actual displaced people, but we are looking at an area level aggregate shock as a treatment. And identification strategy is relying on a well-established IV, which is used by other people and following Del Carpio and Wagner paper, which is a distance-based measure of exposure for Syrian refugee migration, and then which is then used to estimate on the female employment outcomes, which is then linked to the domestic or intimate partner violence outcomes. Which the paper uses two purpose-designed surveys at the core on domestic violence, as well as combined with many other data sets, which is labor force surveys and other supplementary data, which is commendable, and rules out a set of alternative channels. I'll come back to these issues one by one when I'm discussing about some of the issues that I see as concerns. First, start with the contributions and strengths. First of all, it's a very clearly written paper. I really like reading it, enjoying it, enjoyed from the beginning to the end. There's a good narrative, good flow. And there's this impressive data work, which many data sets combined, which many outcomes are tested. And then there's a strong identification strategy, although I have some reservations about the way that we interpret them. And then there's also a good, this is a very good addition to a series of papers which focus on the broader social outcomes of the mass Syrian refugee migration. And that gives us a clearer, bigger picture about its impact on the Turkish society overall, while looking at and this is a very important and hot topic in Turkey, intimate partner violence, and adding to the literature at this new outcome is clearly policy relevant. And this paper really exploits a good data set that looks at various dimensions of intimate partner violence in a rich way, which is also a strength of the paper. And the empirical strategy, as I mentioned before, because it's well established, it protects us from various concerns about the correlations that are existing and prevalent in the previous studies. And it also contributes to the debate at large globally on the economic determinants of intimate partner violence, which is an internationally growing literature, and which is nicely summarized by the authors saying that there's kind of two different effects on the high income countries versus low income countries, where the channels go in opposite direction in this growing literature. And sadly, Turkey is really grouped with the low income countries in that context. And there are a few issues. One of the things is I find it a bit harder to understand the design in IV because it's not very intuitively clear. What is not intuitively clear was for me whether we should be thinking about a late effect in this particular setting and a local average treatment effect, or whether we are interested in some other estimate under these large scale area shocks. I'll get back to this. And then there's also general point is the room for improvement and transparency related to data quality and measurement. There are quite a lot of tables that are related to robustness checks, but not very much summary statistics. There was except one summary statistics table, which is about the main data. And then in order to be able to understand how the actually identification strategy work within this instrument, I had to go back to and read Del Caprio and Wagner paper, the original paper that gives us the more details about the design. And in order to understand how these composite indices related to outcome measures worked, I had to go back to the author's other paper where they give more detail about those things too. So you need to read a bit more around these papers to fully understand and appreciate the paper. But there are also a number of issues that are not very clear, and the transparency might help. One of them is basically nonlinearity and sampling variation within this particular data set, within this particular group of people, because intimate partner violence is experienced by a very specific population subgroup. And within that very specific population subgroup, the nature of the violence indicators, psychological, sexual, physical violence indicators might be either cumulatively overlapping, or they might be affected by other types of nonlinearities related to it. Whereas when, the economists, when we do run models where everything is run on the linear scale, so we want to know a bit more about how much crime that we are committing by running these all linear models on a very exotic sample. And then summary statistics really help if we want to see. But when you read Del Caprio and Wagner paper, some of these sampling variations in two different data points and slightly change in survey designs and so on, they make a really strong case about why it doesn't really matter, which I would appreciate this paper really gets, borrow some of those arguments and then use it in their defense to say that those sampling variations by design doesn't matter, because actually it's the difference between predicted migration exposure versus the actual migration exposure is what is being instrumented here. So another main point was basically the paper all along is agnostic towards what is extensive margin, what is intensive margin. When it comes to female employment, when it comes to earnings, when it comes to even domestic tasks, like binary indicators abound, and when it's used like continuous indicators about monthly earnings, no discussions about what is zeros in the log versus what is the continuous part of the distribution. So it matters, and I'll come back to it why it matters too for policy reasons. And another point is basically the effect size is unclear, which leaves us quite unsatisfied at the end of the paper, that we don't know whether these are big effects, whether these are small effects, whether we should care about them, not care about them. And there's very little interpretation about these effect sizes in the paper other than just signs and significance levels, which is a bit unfortunate because the policy implications are quite tricky given the mechanisms and channels and not elaborated sufficiently in the paper. And I'll come back to these issues a bit more. I'll try to be quicker. So this is the traditional IV approach where we want to have an exogenous variation where F statistics is higher than 10, and we want to look at the relationship free from unobserved confounders. In the original paper, Del Caprio and Wagner, where they used these IV strategy, the interest is basically trying to understand the effect of migration on the employment outcomes of natives. Well, then it works because distance-based measures get around all the confounders which are related to selection of migrants conditional on the area characteristics. And the relationship becomes like directly from the distance-based measures through exposure to migration, which is the variable that we want to instrument in the original design to look at the labor market outcomes. Whereas in this paper, the authors do slightly bit something different, where the instrument is instrumenting the outcome in the previous paper, and to look at the experience of 3 types of violence. And then the problem is basically first thinking about the exclusion restriction, and then the second issue is about which are these things are actually through the channels. We may be not caring about the channels, and we might be just interested in the causal effect, whether it's there or not. But actually the authors go one more mile, commendable, and to look at or rule out one by one a number of channels, whether the true interpretation of the effect goes through decreasing in empowerment within the household. They rule out the channels, but without really specifying, are they exclusion restriction related channels or are they really mechanism-based channels? Why do they make a difference? Because they make difference in the policy implications that we are going to say at the end. For example, the authors rule out the changing attitudes against violence. It can be a direct channel between female employment and experience of violence, which would be fine that we want to know about the mechanism, but it can be something that violates exclusion restriction too. It's unclear where it stands. Changing marriage markers is clearly something that violates exclusion restriction, so we want to rule out that for sure. Changing co-residence patterns may or may not be something that we want to rule out, depending on how we interpret that channel. If that channel is something that violates exclusion restriction, as the authors talk about housing market, like paper by Professor Tuman, and then we may want to rule out that. Or it may be just one of the mechanisms that we want to explore, whether that's a direct mechanism and part of the effect that we want to capture. And finally, the changes in division of household, like labor within the household, whether husbands and wives do different tasks because of displacement, it is written as if it's a mechanism because of female employment effects, like as a channel here, not an exclusion restriction violation. And then they rule out that it's not the case. I was interested in particular in this part because I would be like, I'll come back to this, but the primary importance of being displaced is basically time budget increases dramatically. If time budget within the couples increases dramatically, then wives may be still doing the cooking, but they do better food they more elaborate cuisine, where the husband's preferred food or other things, which might be reducing tensions at home, given the time budget is increasing. If that is the case, that's an explanation mechanism still within the context of female employment reduction or displacement effect or other things, which is part of the explanation rather than something that we want to rule out in the first place. So I thought that one of the biggest issues in this paper is to clarify which one of these channels actually the ones that we want to rule out because they violate exclusion restriction, compared to which one of these channels that we want to actually explain or build into our explanation why we observe these effects. And that matters because that will give us a direction in what type of policy implication that we're going to be talking about at the end with this paper. So when it comes to transparency, as I say, summary statistics on the pooled sample, we want to see, like the other paper, the original Wagner and Del Caprio paper does, separately by year, so that we can actually judge what happened between two waves in the means, like between 2008 to 2014. And also there's almost no discussion about whether we should be freely poolable. Some statisticians will be very worried about the changes in survey designs and pooling these two samples unquestionably. And we might want to just say something, get our retaliation in first in the paper that may not be relevant. And also, like this, the authors only report the summary statistics on the outcome measures based on composite indices. And I want to see where in the distribution these violence indices are taking place, even though we know the standardized Z-scores and the means and the composite indices are like quite shifted in low parts of the distribution, but it's hard to judge what's going on here. And also there's this Appendix A, which essentially a very long list of binary variables, which are
help in a minute or so?
Yeah, I will. Thanks. So I'll just go back to key measure issues. One of the paper talks about female employment both in the title and in the data, and they look at the log earnings and hours worked in the household labor force survey, but it's never actually an employment. It's always about whether people have worked in the past or has a personal income, extensive margin. And we want to know what's happening with the intensive margin and what's happening with this two data sets when they look at the both employment measures. It's comparable with the original Wagner paper too. So binary domestic tasks also carries problems of extensive margin versus intensive margin. This is one case that I doubt that in Turkey, no one would be shifting dramatically on the extensive margin, who does ironing versus who does cooking because of migrants arrived. It will be only on the intensive margin. Women who were doing ironing, they will be doing a bit more. Women who will be doing cooking, they will be doing a bit more. So intensive margin is clearly the case. So I don't really buy the ruling out like table and analysis on this case, because we are really asking too much of a change from the data on extensive margin that all of a sudden men will start doing all the cooking, which is very unrealistic to expect this. Finally, no effect sizes. I'm not going to beat the dead horse here. So we want to know about the effect sizes. And we want to also know whether ever experiencing IPV decrease versus among those who experience the level of violence decrease for policy reasons. If more people are exerting violence, that's a worrisome thing. Or if the people who are exerting fewer people versus the people who are already reducing the amount of violence, there are two different types of implications about who's actually experiencing the violence here due to migrants. Finally, policy implication parts. This is huge. We want to know about why it's happening, and it's hot in the agenda. So if we want to say some of those channels are operating because of free time, because of other characteristics, then the policy implication will be very different than if we want to say female employment is bad. It's tricky because we have a conservative government, and it's tricky that we know a good chunk of the country doesn't really want female employment or women working in the markets. And we don't want to be advancing an argument here in this paper saying that, you see, female employment has one another negative outcome. So when we reduce that, domestic violence goes away. So this is a very tricky thing to sell. And we want to be absolutely sure that we want to line up with that literature in terms of what is a true mechanism and true channel here before giving any message. And also, if the paper is about Syrian refugee migration rather than female employment itself, like the original ID, then this is something, a positive that we want to talk about. You see Syrian migrants actually reduce the domestic violence in Turkey, which is a very different pitching of the paper than saying, you see female employment really hampers the women's outcomes. So finally, I want to have some heterogeneity by presence of children, and that will be making the policy implication and motivation stronger, which is also the motivation argument in the paper. So this is really a good addition to the literature. I really look forward to reading the published paper. Congratulate the authors. I saw on the website at RNR at JD, great outlet. I hope that it opens up opportunities for new waves of data collection and better linkages and quality as well, because this is really an important topic. And I hope that there's also more scholarly discussion on where the sign for positive effect turns negative on the development gradients. Because the initial motivation was Turkey is very similar to the very low income countries, sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, when it comes to like empowerment measures of women, increases female domestic violence. That was one of the flagship messages of the paper. Whereas this is not the case in UK, US, and Spain, and a few other countries. Why Turkey is more similar in this dimension to very low-income countries compared to other countries, and where does this change in the sign happens across the gradient scale, would be a great scholarly discussion at the end. Thank you very much for the chance.
Thank you very much, Berkay, for this insightful discussion. Do you want to respond to some of the main comments in a couple of minutes, and then we will have some questions also raised from the audience, Bilge?
Yes, thank you very much, Orkun. This was a very, very important discussion. Thank you very much, Berkay, for really doing a very careful reading of the paper and highlighting a number of important points that we still need to address. And yes, it's the R&R and JD, so we are actually right now doing the revision, so these comments are extremely useful. So thank you for that. In terms of, I agree, we could do more on the summary statistics, provide a better understanding of just the descriptive state of the data and dividing it by year. I think we should definitely do that. We can do a number of additional things that the Wagner paper does. So definitely we can incorporate those in the paper. So one thing is that because they look at only labor market, their paper, you know, they can do a little bit more in that sense, but we have just so many more outcomes and many more channels that we have to look at. We had to sort of like downplay the number of descriptive evidence in the paper. In terms of extensive or intensive margin, I totally agree. We can do more on that, particularly in the labor market side. In terms of the DHS data, I agree it's limited, and I didn't have time to talk about it. So it has only information about who predominantly does this type of work. And I agree with you that it may not necessarily shift in that dimension, while it can actually shift in terms of the time allocated in a particular task. And it would be good if we could actually use like time use information. Unfortunately, it does, like the existing time use surveys in Turkey doesn't help us do that. We have a data limitation there. And definitely I agree with the size of the effects. I will just say they're small. They're there, but I think why are they small? Because the labor market effect is small. It's about 8% labor market effect. So consequent effect on the domestic violence is also fairly small. In terms of the violation of exclusion restriction versus the channel, so all of those outcomes that you listed, we actually think all of those violate the exclusion restriction, because our argument is that Syrian refugee inflows in this particular context only impacted female employment, and only through that all of these effects on domestic violence we observe took place. So we should, I agree, be more explicit on that front, but that is essentially our argument. Thank you, Orkun.
Thank you very much, Bilge. So I have a series of questions here, but I'm not going to be able to give the floor to everyone. So I'm going to just start with Gözde first. Gözde.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Orkun. Thank you, Bilge, for a very interesting presentation and a very original paper. We see a lot of papers that are looking at the effects of refugee inflows on the labor market outcomes, but it's also very interesting to see the repercussions on different outcomes such as domestic violence. I have two questions / comments. The first is rather more technical. I share part of the concerns with Berkay on the exclusion restrictions about the DIV. And I was wondering, could you use, for example, a Bartik instrument, which uses the shares of refugees inflowing to the provinces, for example? Would that be a more transparent and perhaps more easily interpretable empirical strategy? And there are lots of new working papers that are on using Bartik share instrument in quasi-experimental design. So maybe you could have a look at that if that works. And the second is, I was thinking whether the results might potentially be driven by the employment in the informal sector, because as you said, so we've seen these differences in the male and female employment outcomes, and could it be because there are, so we know we cannot measure perfectly informal employment, right, in these surveys. So could it be if there are maybe more women who are working in, you know, like as working in houses, cleaning ladies, etc., working in the informal sector, and this is partly driving the results. So there are two things I could think of. The first is I know that there's a variable measuring informal sector in the household labor force survey. I'm not sure about the quality of the variable. Perhaps you could check this out, whether it's balanced or something. And the second, maybe for a different follow-up paper, it was very interesting that you mentioned this introduction of the work permits to the Syrian refugees introduced in 2016. So could you do maybe another empirical exercise which works exclusively at the formal sector and maybe use this introduction of the work permits as an exogenous variation? Thank you very much.
Thank you. These are very interesting comments. So in terms of Bartik instrument, so we cannot use the share of refugees within a Bartik instrument because we think that is endogenous to the outcomes. So that is in fact sort of the share of refugee is the endogenous variable that we are trying to instrument with. And there, you know, there in general, the literature has two types of instruments. One is like more travel distance-based instrument, taking into account that refugees are going to go to places where the travel costs are lower. The other instrument is sort of refugees will go to places where there are more ethnic ties, where there's more Arabic speaking population. So we tried both. So they actually give fairly similar results. I agree that they are going to have different complier populations. So one is sort of comparing people who are, you know, trying to get in places that are easier to get, right? So lower travel costs versus higher travel costs. The other one is comparing places that are sort of higher ethnic ties to lower ethnic ties. So it's a little bit different complier population, but in terms of the effects, actually we find very, very similar effects. And in terms of the informal sector, I agree, you know, there can be more that can be done with the HLFS. It's the thing is that with the domestic violence survey, it's not all that consistent with the HLFS, but it's true, like for the labor market outcomes, we could do that using the HLFS. And you were thinking about maybe looking at just the formal sector employment, looking at the work permit, right? So we should actually see no effect on the formal sector. And like one thing we look at is the private versus public, and actually we see that all of the effect is on the private, which has informality. On the public sector, which is completely formal, we find no effect. So I think that's suggestive in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilga and Berkay. Very nice discussion and paper, and the question was also quite insightful. I have a series of questions, but I think I'm not going to be able to raise them. I want to give people 4 minutes of break before the next paper. But obviously, all of these texts that you're sending to the chairs as questions are going to be saved, and you know they will be directed to the paper presenters. So if you have questions, so even about the earlier papers, just feel free to write to them, write them to us, and we will raise them with the speakers. So now we can take like 4 minutes of break before the next paper. See you soon.
Yeah, feel free to email us also.
Exactly. Thank you. See you.
Thanks.
All right. Hello, everyone. So we have come to the last but not least paper of the day. So in the second paper, again, the topic is going to be violence, but a different sort. So we are going to look at how economic shocks, again, could change people's willingness to participate in violent activities. So Oli is going to be presenting his paper. Is Oli, I'm not able to see Oli. Oh, Oli is there. Okay, great. Oli, the floor is yours for half an hour, and then we will go on with the discussion. Please. We cannot hear you.
Hello. All right. Let me, it looks like screen sharing is disabled. It says host disabled attendee screen sharing.
What's here? Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay now. Okay. All right. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm excited to share with you something that I've been working on for quite some time now, and that has taken many forms, actually including since the draft paper that I submitted to this conference. So I apologize in advance to the discussant. But basically, the question that I'm asking here today is whether or not the irrigation wrought by the Southeastern Anatolia project has affected conflict in southeastern Turkey. So before I get into more details about the paper and the models, I thought I would start by giving some general context about the region and why I chose to ask the questions that I'm asking. So the first important thing to consider is obviously the conflict itself. So this is the Kurdish insurgency that I'm focusing on in Turkey's southeast. It's been going on for quite some time now. It's occurring in the context of a relatively high poverty in this region compared to the rest of Turkey. Estimates ranged to about just under 50% of the population in this area living on less than $1 a day in 2007. And this has led a lot of Kurdish insurgent movements to express the Kurdish identity question in sort of Marxist terms, which leads to the sort of general socialist character of a lot of these movements. And similarly, originally, a lot of these movements were primarily rurally based, recruiting largely from agricultural and farming communities. So an insurgency in the context of high levels of poverty and agricultural dependence. At the same time, the Turkish government broke ground on a large infrastructural development project, the Southeastern Anatolia project. So the aim of this project in sort of the exact goals were to build 19 dams, 22 hydropower plants, and almost 2 million hectares of irrigation. And there's substantial evidence that the switch from rain-fed agriculture to irrigated agriculture brings significant income gains ranging between 3- and 7-fold, depending on the crop mix. So beyond these sort of technical targets, there was also quite an explicit hope by the Turkish government that this would help remedy the Kurdish insurgency. And thanks to WikiLeaks, you no longer have to take my word for it. You can actually read it right here. So this is a cable that was written by the US Embassy in Ankara following many interviews with Turkish government officials. It was classified until it was leaked, and it was written in 2008. So it bears reading in its entirety. So most government of Turkey officials believe that greater focus on economic and social development in Turkey's southeast will have the greatest positive impact on ethnic Kurds' views towards the Turkish state. If Kurds are gainfully employed, have better educational opportunities, and see increased levels of infrastructure development throughout the region, their affinity for the terrorist PKK will wane further. A top priority is ensuring the completion of the massive Southeastern Anatolia project within 5 years. So fairly black and white, the Turkish government very much had an explicit hope that this project would decrease the appeal of various insurgent movements. So there's ethnographic evidence that suggests that this is correct. So Layla Harris, anthropologist at UBC, went to southeastern Turkey during the height of the conflict, actually, in the 1990s, and interviewed farmers who had recently received irrigation. What you see going on here, actually, also, as a side note, is the construction of the Atatürk Dam here, and ensuing irrigation in Haran and Suruç. So she interviewed people not only in these areas, but all over the region, and found quite striking quotes from these farmers. So our views of the state changed positively. We had hatred before, but now they started investing in the southeast. We did not trust the state before, but it brought electricity, water, phone, etc. to us, and now we trust the state a lot. At last, the state has turned its face towards us. You get the idea. So people who receive irrigation from the government in this area in which there is high levels of poverty and high levels of agricultural dependence, there is a mechanism through which that translates into a sort of enhanced sense of state legitimacy in this area. Conversely, a farmer who was interviewed who did not receive irrigation asked, why should I not support PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan? So these are sort of the pieces of the puzzle that led me to ask this question. So although there are these strong indications that these factors might be related, there actually is no quantitative study of whether or not this irrigation had a systematic effect on reducing conflict in this region. So beyond the sort of subject-specific reasons for looking at this, there's a gap in the global literature on infrastructure and conflict. So there's a lot of work assessing the impact of infrastructure projects on development. This paper by Duflo, which uses an IV to measure the impact of dams on poverty, for example. There's a lot of work on the relationship between development and conflict. So a recent one is the effect of rainfall shocks on conflict likelihood in Africa, for example. But there's very little work on the impact of infrastructure projects on actual conflict, which is strange given that governments spend billions of dollars targeting infrastructural investments for this exact purpose quite explicitly, as we saw earlier. And within this sort of research area of the microeconomics of violent conflict, Blattman and Miguel set out the research agenda as being the most promising avenue for new empirical research, being on the subnational scale, analyzing conflict causes, conduct, and consequences at the level of armed groups, communities, and individuals. And so that's what I've tried to do in this paper. So assessing the impact of state-provided irrigation on conflict incidents and insurgent recruitment in southeastern Turkey. And I do this using a wide array of original social, political, and economic covariates at a very high spatial resolution. So just a quick preview of the findings. I'll go into more depth later. Irrigation is consistently negatively related to conflict incidents and recruitment, robust to a number of different specifications. The panel models indicate that the effect of irrigation is almost half as strong as the effect of a ceasefire between the PKK and the Turkish government, although this effect drops when we restrict the sample to only irrigated areas. And the cross-sectional IV model suggests that a fully irrigated area is nearly 8 times less likely to experience a conflict event than a fully unirrigated area. So briefly how this is going to proceed, I've done an introduction now, and I'm going to proceed to data collection, empirical strategy, then results and conclusion. So data collection, this is a superimposition of several of the variables of interest here. So this is the southeastern Anatolia region. These are the provinces that are covered officially by the project. Green is irrigation, red is urban land cover, and these black dots are PKK recruits. So I'll talk about all of these variables individually now. The main dependent variable is conflict, and I use 2 different measures of conflict. For the longitudinal models, the panel models, I use the UCDP dataset. This is, has a long history in economics, is one of the most widely used datasets. And then for the cross-sectional models, I use the ACLED dataset, which is more recent and more detailed, but sadly only limited to 2016 onwards for Turkey. And in both cases, the measure of conflict is binary, so it's conflict incidence or lack thereof. And this is based on most recent literature, Harari and LaFerrara, who use very similar methods, who focus also on conflict incidence. So that's just these conflict events mapped out to get a sense of the spatial distribution. Another variable through which we can measure sort of the conflict itself is PKK recruitment. These were sent to me through correspondence with Güneş Murat Tejgür, who's a Kurdish academic who published a paper in APSR in which he scraped the PKK's website for obituaries, geocoded their birthplaces, and integrated the information about when they were recruited. And so this is, I just mapped out these data points. This is another variable that's used as a robustness check instead of conflict incidence. So the main independent variable in all cases is irrigation. And this is measured, this is a measure that I constructed from satellite imagery analysis using Landsat satellites. And just to show you basically the variation in treatment timing here, we have Kızıltepe getting irrigated as a result of the construction of the Atatürk Dam around 1996. You can see irrigation increasing quite rapidly after that, whereas places farther away, so Suruç, for example, which, if I'm not mistaken, was irrigated from the Birecik Dam, only received irrigation around 2010. So there's actually quite a bit of cross-sectional variation in the timing of irrigation. And I use several different measures of irrigation. One of them, the main one, is a sort of a treatment measure pre-post irrigation, but I use several other ones for robustness as well. And this is just sort of the source data to show you how this measure was constructed. So this is a 1-year time lapse of the growing season, of the entire season in Turkey. And you can see quite strongly irrigated areas being visible with the use of a vegetation index throughout the summer months. There's some auxiliary processing involved, but I won't spend too much time on that. Another important covariate is rainfall. So this affects income. So most non-irrigated farmers are income limited through rainfall, and red values indicate lack of rainfall, blue values indicate higher quantities of rainfall. And as you can see, drought events get progressively more frequent as time goes on. Another very important variable to consider is nighttime lights. So this is often used as a proxy for development. Here I use, I sort of show longitudinal variables, longitudinal variation in nighttime lights. And what you can see here is development really happening. Over here, you can see a string of lights emerging between just sort of west of Urfa. And this is a highway project that's being built. You can see Antep here growing beyond its borders in 1992. You can see villages, these tiny dots that grow in strength, or in some cases just appear. So this helps us distinguish urban and settled areas from sort of more rural areas, but it also allows us to track development. So which areas benefit, which areas grew economically throughout this period. I'll touch on that again in a second. This is a slightly higher resolution version that's more recent that I also use. And this is used for cross-sectional identification of urban and non-urban areas. And this actually, you know, a lot of people are missing from censuses and other data sources, but for example, you know, we've spent a lot of time talking about refugees today who aren't included in a lot of data that you can download from TÜİK. But this, for example, right here, this dot is the Ceylanpınar refugee camp. So this allows us to, you know, even account for people who aren't on a lot of sort of census data and official data sources. So another reason to use nightlights is because of its strong correlation with a lot of development indicators. This is a plot that I made that shows the relationship between log nightlights and illiteracy. And as you can see, there's quite a strong negative relationship. The more luminous an area is, the lower the illiteracy rates are. So we're using this sort of to parse out the effect of general economic development from the effect of irrigation specifically. Roads, also important for obvious reasons. Political outcomes. This is a battery of control variables that is very important to the overall analysis. I scraped about 3 million ballot box level election results in order to generate this data set. It comprises 20 elections over the course of 10 years at all levels. And the level of spatial detail is quite high. As you can see in Diyarbakir here, there's like a 200-meter distance between these ballot boxes in some cases. And this tells us several important things about the political economy of the region that we need to separate out from the influence of irrigation. The first is just simply population. Even though nightlights does give us an indication of this, this gives us sort of an intensity estimate of population. So basically, we know how many people are registered at each one of these ballot boxes. Actually, the size of these circles is determined by the number of registered voters, and assumingly a roughly consistent proportion of registered voters throughout the region, this would give us like a fairly reasonable estimate of how many people live in a certain area. And this allows us to create a measure of population that can be aggregated sort of at different spatial levels depending on what we want to do. Another very important variable derived from these political data beyond just the actual vote shares themselves is Ashiret presence. So the presence of tribes in this area affect both dependent and independent variables. So tribal social structures are correlated with the dependent variables, probably because some tribes have allied with the PKK, while others have made deals with the government to become sort of the state's vanguard against the PKK. But they also affect the independent variable because the distribution of land in these areas, in tribally administered areas, is much less equal than the rest of the region. Many have called it feudal because the chieftain owns all of the land and everyone else is a tenant farmer. So this might actually temper the effect, the income effect of the switch to irrigation. So tribes can actually be identified through their practice of Birleşik Oy, so combined voting. Ethnographic accounts indicate that many villages vote en masse, so everyone at once without making a single deviance sometimes for the party chosen by the chieftain. And to show you what that looks like, this is one of the ballot boxes, one of the 3 million ballot boxes that I scraped. You can see here 0 votes for the AKP, 0 MHP, 000, 1 vote actually for İYİ Parti, but that could have actually been the visiting election official. It's customary for them apparently to vote with the chieftain as well, and 154 consecutive votes for HDP. So even in an HDP stronghold, we wouldn't expect this level of, this is sort of like highly anomalous, right? But it does align with ethnographic literature on tribal voting behavior. So once we've identified these using a cutoff, it's just a matter of mapping them out. So I've isolated here ballot boxes in which Birleşik Oy was detected and disaggregated by party. So AKP instances are coded in red. And so in Şanlıurfa, we can see this aligns with a lot of what we know about the region as well, because especially in Haran, for example, a lot of Arabs, a lot of Arab tribes. And so this does appear to be capturing sort of variation, both in like the ethnic makeup of the region, and then also in the eastern portion, we have sort of a dense concentration of HDP affiliated tribes, or likely tribes, I should say. So additional controls that I won't spend time on here, cell area, ceasefire periods between the PKK and the government, the onset of the Syrian civil war, and the sort of topographical information. So now we begin the task of trying to parse out the effect of irrigation from the very complex political economy of this region. So I do this in 2 ways. There are 2 main research questions that I ask. The first one is longitudinal, so whether or not conflict decreases following the introduction of irrigation. And for that, I use 2 sets of models. The first is a panel OLS model with spatial and serial correction, so Conley standard errors adjusted for panel models by Solomon Siang. And the second set of models is a spatial Durbin model, estimated to be a maximum likelihood. This is following the methodology of Harari and LaFerrara. And this actually integrates spatial dependence into the model itself and allows us to look at things like spillovers as well. This is calculated at the, estimated at the 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid cell level. And the panel lasts from 1985 to 2019. And then the second main sort of question is whether or not the current iteration of the conflict, so there's been a resurgence in fighting in recent times, whether this new iteration of the conflict is lower in irrigated areas. And to estimate this, accounting for possible endogeneity, I use a spatially autoregressive instrumental variables approach. And I use a slightly finer spatial scale here, 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers. And I just pull values for conflict across 3 years from 2016 to 2019. So briefly, because the analysis is taking place at such a high spatial level of disaggregation, there is a serious problem of spatial autocorrelation. So the fact that neighboring cells often have a higher likelihood of displaying similar values than faraway cells, this violates IID and will bias non-spatial models. So to account for this, we use a spatial weights matrix. several different kinds. The most simple kind is a contiguity matrix, which assigns a value of 1 to all of the neighbors of a given cell, and then divides by the number of neighbors. And this accounts for both spillovers and also autocorrelation between conflict determinants and conflict itself. So an inverse distance matrix, same principle, but instead of contiguity is inverse distance to the cell of interest. And so what this looks like when we use it in practice is, so here we have the irrigation variable in 2019. So Haran over here, Ceylanpınar and Diyarbakır over here, high irrigation variables in all 3 cases. When we apply a contiguity matrix, it effectively, it looks like a convolution, right? So it's just slightly, it's like a slight blur. Whereas when we use an inverse distance matrix, it's a much stronger effect and sort of creates sort of a center of gravity of where irrigation is in the region, and then spillovers that decay with distance. So now that we've explained the spatial dimension to all of this, this is the spatial Durbin model. So the dependent variable is conflict in cell C, district I, and time t. The independent variables are a lagged drought index, irrigation, which is our primary sort of explanatory variable, the cross-sectional controls that I just spoke of, time period controls that include, for example, ceasefire periods or the Syrian civil war, a 1-year lag of conflict, which accounts for serial correlation in conflict incidence. So the fact that conflict in 1 year is more, if an area experienced conflict in the previous year, it's more likely to experience conflict in the following year. Here are the spatially autoregressive terms. So a spatial weight of the conflict variable to account for conflict spillovers across cells. The drought index interacted with the weighting matrix, irrigation variable, and the cross-sectional controls also interacted with the weighting matrix, and then several fixed effects and time trend. So the identification assumption for the panel model is that in the absence of irrigation, cell level outcomes would have followed the same path over time in cells that receive irrigation in different years, conditional on the controls and fixed effects. So in other words, that the probability of experiencing a conflict event would not have been different in a cell depending on when the cell received irrigation. Now, an issue with identification here is the endogeneity of irrigation investments. So cells, areas that receive irrigation may also be politically connected. They may also have higher potential agricultural productivity. Indeed, it would make sense from the government's perspective to target these areas for their higher potential agricultural productivity, or have had lower baseline levels of conflict. The solution to this problem, a previous model that I used was a difference in difference, but to go sort of a step further, instead of considering non-irrigated areas as potentially a control group, is to completely omit areas that never receive irrigation and restrict the sample to only areas that at some point become irrigated. So the second set of models are spatially autoregressive instrumental variables. So approaches, and in this instance, it's again conflict, and the irrigation variable is instrumented with topography, which I'll talk about in a second. Then there are cross-sectional controls, spatially weighted version of the cross-sectional controls, and again, a spatial lag of conflict itself, and spatially lagged error term as well. So the instrument for the instrumental variables approach is a topographical index. So in order to receive irrigation, an area must be below its distributary dam and be relatively flat. So what I've got here is actually in Suruç. So this is a dam. Red areas are below the altitude of this dam, and blue areas are observed irrigated fields. So as you can see, there's a very strong relationship between the two. Now, this does work in and of itself, but there's a slight issue, which is that dams are at different altitudes. And so using one cutoff is slightly complicated, and a better approach that I found. So previous version of this paper, I used a regression discontinuity using the altitude of dams. but an approach that I found worked better was to actually exploit the second topographical constraint of irrigation, which is that it has to be relatively flat, right? You can't really irrigate a hillside, it would just flow down the hill. So by interacting actually altitude and slope and logging the product, you basically create an index of areas that are low and flat and areas that are high and sloping. So the identification strategy in this instance rests on two assumptions. So the relevance assumption, which is that topography actually does affect potential exposure to irrigation. In other words, that the instrument isn't weak. And the exclusion restriction, which is that the only way that irrigation affects conflict is through, that topography affects conflict is through the irrigation mechanism. So on the, I could show you the Kleiberg and Pop statistic. It's very strong, I assure you, but I think a much more sort of intuitive way of understanding the relationship between these variables is by looking at them. So these are 5 kilometer square grid cells. This is the instrument topography, and this is observed irrigation. We can clearly see Haran, we can clearly see irrigation along the Tigris and the sort of Mardin area as well. So there is a very strong sort of relationship between the instrument and the explanatory variable. The exclusion restriction, however, is violated. And it is violated by the fact that topography doesn't only affect irrigation, it affects conflict directly because the PKK, as you can see, will position many of its bases in mountainous areas. This gives them sort of a terrain advantage over the Turkish government. The solution to this is relatively straightforward. If we plot a histogram of the elevation profile of the region, the mountains become quite readily identifiable and quite readily excludable. So restrict the sample to only include non-mountainous areas. So moving to results, here we have the results of the panel models column. So this is the main variable of interest, pre-post irrigation. And here we have OLS estimates and Durbin model estimates. The columns 1 and 2 use the full sample. Columns 3 and 4 restrict the sample to only areas that are irrigated at some point throughout the study period. As you can see, there's a consistent negative association between areas that sort of the post-irrigation phase of areas, and that's accounting for a wide range of control variables. The coefficients on the control variables are themselves interesting. So the main effect is that there's a roughly 2% decline in the probability of experiencing conflict following the introduction of irrigation. But these auxiliary sort of coefficients are important as well. Positive associations between road cover and population indicates that these attacks are not taking place in the middle of nowhere, they're taking place in populated areas, and elevation for the reasons we discussed. Another useful diagnostic is that the AKP vote share coefficient is consistently negative. And so, that tells us that this is functioning roughly intuitively, right? In this area, you either support Erdogan or you support the PKK. It's kind of an either or deal. So this is a bit of a useful diagnostic. Alternative measures, I won't spend too much time on, but here I vary the measure of irrigation to irrigated area in square kilometers and years since irrigation. And here I use recruitment instead of the UCDP conflict incidence variable. And the effect is consistent across all specifications. And here is just sort of a plot of the OLS estimates. And even though the effect itself appears quite small, in the full sample, it's roughly half as strong as the effect of a ceasefire between the PKK and the government. As we can see, also a positive spillover effect from the Syrian civil war on violence in southeastern Turkey. So yeah, I think I basically just told you about this. So moving swiftly on to the cross-sectional models, these are the instrumental variables results. So the baseline probability of experiencing conflict, the mean of the conflict variable across this cross-section is almost 7%. In a completely unirrigated area, it's about 11%. And in a completely irrigated area, the probability of experiencing at least one conflict event is around 1%. And this effect is also significant and similar in magnitude if we restrict the conflict incidence variable to only include conflict instances that were initiated by the PKK. So in plain English, what this means is between 2016 and 2019, a village in a fully irrigated area was roughly 5 times less likely to experience one conflict event than a random village, and roughly 8 times less likely to experience one conflict event than a village in a non-irrigated area. But again, the baseline likelihood of experiencing conflict is quite low. I already talked about these robustness checks. Potential mechanisms, the Collier and Hofler's opportunity cost of rebellion is one. Although beyond the income effect, there appears to be an effect of irrigation on the perception of the government. So this is a smallholder I interviewed in Suruc who said, in the old days, we could not even produce 100 kilos of wheat. Some years there would be drought, we could not grow anything, and there would be famine. Now we export wheat, we grow cotton, we have money for equipment and tractors. We do not forget who dug the canals. So, you know, beyond money in their pocket and this informing their labor market decisions, it seems to actually strongly affect the way in which they perceive the Turkish state as an actor in their lives. So the conclusion, important caveat, can you irrigate the PKK away? Definitely not. You would run out of water at some point, and also too many of the PKK's grievances do not actually involve soil moisture. They, in fact, they involve social, cultural, and political factors. And indeed, GAP has caused new grievances, including the flooding of Hasan Cave earlier this year, and increases in rural inequality. Nevertheless, there are important implications from the results. So taken together, the negative association between nightlight's growth and conflict, and between irrigation and conflict, taken together with the fact that there's a strong sort of serial dependence in conflict itself, indicates that carrots seem to be more effective than sticks in this area, which is an important conclusion given that the current sort of government's approach is heavily stick-based. And finally, the methodological contributions here are, you know, trying to understand a conflict and its dynamics, gathering bespoke data thereon, and building models accordingly to prevent spurious results. As I mentioned, you know, if I ever saw a strong positive correlation between AKP support and PKK recruitment, I might step back and think, you know, what happened in this regression? And so the coefficients on the control variables are themselves, in and of themselves, important for interpreting the conflict. And this is also significant because a lot of the current sort of dominant approach in economics towards the study of conflict involves still large cross-country fixed effects regressions. And then finally, the empirical contribution is also in and of itself important. This is the subject of considerable debate in Turkey, but there is a near complete lack of evidence thereon. And these findings also have implications for countries where development projects are being undertaken in conflict areas all over the globe. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.
Thank you very much, Oli. An impressive data work, I would say. So I'm gonna pass the microphone now to your discussant, Ian. Ian, you have 10 minutes to discuss the paper.
Okay, I don't think I'll take the whole 10 minutes actually, because as you said, there's been quite some changes from the draft that I got. So I'm just trying to see which of these comments are still relevant. I had some initial skepticism of the identification strategy in the original paper. It sounds like you moved completely away from that. One thing I did like from the original paper that I thought was, yeah.
Do you have slides to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just keep them for now because they're in response to results that were presented. So
that's fine. You want to go on?
Yeah, I just have a few comments that I'll read. So I like the original idea of just this kind of cutoff with elevation. So it sounds like there's a problem with that strategy, but to me that sounded like the best means of identification that you had, because it's very intuitive and it shouldn't really affect anything. That if it's above or below the dam, then water can't flow uphill. As you mentioned, with the identification strategy you're using now, it could be, it could not satisfy the exclusion criteria if the PKK is using mountains as bases or these kind of things. Another comment I had is that irrigation, so you're looking at this as being just in terms of changing the recruitment patterns, or well, I guess that was in other paper was about the recruitment patterns. Now you're saying that the violence is also dependent on the economic status of the village, which makes sense. I'm just not sure then kind of where the mechanism of change is, because you have different actors that are all responding to the new equilibrium, and yeah, institutional change. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, it's kind of a lot to process because it's so much different than the original paper. One thing that I had, one comment that's still relevant is that that one of the differences between the existing literature and this paper is rainfall used as an instrument. And so it'd be interesting to kind of try to replicate those results and see if your results are different than the kind of standard approach using rainfall. And then it might kind of explain why there's been a discrepancy in those previous papers, that some of them show that rainfall predicts conflict and some show that it doesn't. So sorry if those are kind of incomplete comments, but as I said, it's a bit challenging because the paper has changed so much. So, but I did enjoy reading the paper, and I think it has a good potential for publication. Okay.
Thank you very much, Ian. Ollie, would you like to come back maybe with a few comments to what Ian told?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ian. And yeah, I apologize again for the amount of change in between the papers. A lot of the original models in the papers they weren't spatial models, and at this level of disaggregation, I felt that was like quite an important thing to account for. In terms of also the change between the dependent variable from recruitment to conflict, so I keep both in the panel model, and the idea behind that is that the recruitment data show sort of where individuals are being recruited from. There's quite a strong relationship between where individuals are, sort of like the spatial distribution of the recruitment variable, and sort of even the longitudinal variation in the recruitment variable and the conflict variables themselves. So it seems like a lot of the character of this conflict is that it is sort of hyperlocal, in that you don't have a huge amount of variation between where the recruitment is taking place and where the conflict events are themselves taking place. Although perhaps in this the newer iteration of the paper, I should sort of more explicitly address the differences between the possible mechanisms sort of that affect recruitment and conflict incidents separately. So that is a helpful piece of feedback. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ollie. I have a series of questions, so I'm going to give the stage to first Kerim Kavaklı, who has 2 questions. Kerim, yeah.
Hi. Thank you, Ollie. This is very impressive work. I had 2 questions. So one of them is, I was wondering if you checked whether there was a positive correlation between rainfall and conflict before the dams were built. If you found such a correlation, I think it would support the causal argument that as people get richer, they become less likely to join or less likely to have conflict in that area. So that was a suggestion. The second thing is it possible, as a causal mechanism, is it possible that the composition of the population has or changes after these dams are built? What could happen is perhaps when a dam is built and area is irrigated, it gains economic value, and some of the people who are anti-government, perhaps some of the poorer people, they are driven out of these areas. Especially if the security forces also know that these people are not very sympathetic to the government, they might even help the remaining population drive these people out. In short, it's possible that the population has changes when these dams are built. Thank you.
Those are 2 very good points. And yeah, as you've correctly identified, a lot of the previous literature focuses on rainfall as sort of an instrument for agricultural income. The issue with that at this level is that the rainfall or like drought indices that integrate also evapotranspiration are quite, they vary also cross-sectionally quite a lot in a way that aligns with the topography of the region. In this area, there do appear to be like slightly heterogeneous effects. In the effect of irrigation, it seems to be stronger. So in the earlier iteration of the paper, I ran a cross-sectional model during a period of sort of exceptional shortfalls in rain, and the effect of irrigation was sort of cross-sectionally stronger. But I would have to do more testing to explore sort of the precise impact of the rainfall and like drought variables on sort of recruitment itself. There are sort of two opposing trends with those. So with rainfall, it's becoming less and less, rainfall is becoming more and more scarce as time goes on, and this is actually noticeable in the data. And the conflict sort of peaked earlier in like the 1990s. So there's that sort of, in terms of comparing different periods, there are those two sort of main trends to account for. In terms of the effect of sort of individuals being driven out of certain areas, I think that's certainly possible. I've poured through quite a lot of anthropological literature in this area, and there are indeed sort of like conflicts between water users, and specifically like who receives water in the rotation is the source of like a considerable amount of animosity between farmers themselves, and this does in fact sort of sometimes lead to either outright violence between farmers, or instances in which the police are called and so on. So I've been thinking about how to try to account for this, but unfortunately it is sort of quantitatively hard to assess that type of movement of like pro-government versus anti-government people, although perhaps using the political data would also provide an avenue through which to do that. But those are two very good leads, and I'll look into them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I think Bilge has a question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the really interesting presentation. I was wondering, I mean, you control, I think, for voting patterns, but as you mentioned, I think, wouldn't it be better to think of those as a channel? Because it could be that just bringing irrigation in a place, it changes political attitudes, and that itself actually can change whether or not to instill violence. So I was also wondering, whether you could sort of show a little bit more on the mechanisms in terms of, for example, what happens to agricultural productivity. I know data limitations are an important issue here, but I think like showing directly the income channel versus like the changes in attitudes, the political attitudes and so on, that could sort of inform us a little bit more about what is the causal mechanism here. Thank you.
Sure. So that is something that I've been working on the latter point about the effect of agricultural income as a mechanism in and of itself. So I've been sort of collecting from TÜIK data on district level crop production. So in the first instance, to see basically how the crop mix and the quantity of production is altered following the introduction of irrigation. So that would, in and of itself, sort of tell you whether or not irrigation has substantial sort of income gains, although it would be useful to precisely identify how that works in this model and then use that for sort of like identifying like mitigation. But in general, the assumption that I'm going under is that irrigation does sort of substantially increase income. On the point about political outcomes, that's also a potential avenue that I've been exploring, although it is complicated because obviously areas receive irrigation at different periods. And so there are sort of two overlapping periods in the political data and the irrigation data, and they're not they don't span the whole length of the data. So it would be limited in terms of the pre-post irrigation variation to areas that received irrigation quite late. So a lot of the main areas that received large amounts of irrigation, such as Haran, were irrigated in the 90s. And so we would effectively only have post-irrigation data in terms of political outcomes for these areas. However, I do think, and it is on my list of things to do with this paper, to explore how irrigation itself does affect political outcomes. And there are very sort of strange trends that become available when you have political data at such a fine level. For example, just through scrolling around in these data after Hasankeyf was flooded, I looked at sort of the voting patterns in Hasankeyf, and they voted basically for Erdogan in every election since 2008 by like considerable margins. And this is an area that's currently underwater. And he announced that he would flood it in 2008, right? And so I do think there are a lot of very interesting patterns to be told by this political data, and I don't think I've explored it nearly adequately enough in its current state. But your suggestions on using it for mitigation are taken, and I will definitely focus on that in the coming iterations of this paper.
Thank you, Oli. We have two quick questions, one from Aydan Ülker and second is from Çağlar Özden. So Aydan, do you want to go first? Just a second. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is about given the nature of this binary nature of the conflict variable 1, 0, to what extent are we confident that we are really capturing the intensity here? And in this regard, I think the PKK recruit data is more suitable, I think, in terms of the outcome that I thought. What do you say about that?
Yeah, that's an important point. So the choice behind using a binary conflict dependent variable comes from the literature. So the most recent paper that sort of analyzes the effect of agricultural income shocks on conflict uses a binary measure of conflict. And this is mostly because with conflict, you have extremely sort of erratic data. So you'll have a bunch of zeros because conflict events are themselves quite rare. And then you'll have a massive either attack by the Turkish government or a bomb planted by the PKK in which you'll have hundreds of casualties. And so if you get a sort of a point estimate, the standard deviation on like sort of a continuous measure of conflict would be pretty extreme. And so arriving at like a precise measure of conflict intensity as a result of irrigation would be difficult. And I think just like for ease of interpretation, the use of the binary variable is kind of more intuitive. Although point taken, this says nothing about conflict intensity and the PKK planting a bomb beneath a car and killing one person and the PKK blowing up an entire police station and killing 300 people both have a value of 1 in my data, and that's just a limitation thereof. In terms of the recruitment variable, I agree. It's really amazing work that Tejgür has done, and I urge everyone to go read that paper as well. It's in APSR, came out in 2016, I think. The only issue with that is that so he talks about this in his paper, but the number of recruitment events that he captures in his data set constitute maybe about 40 to 50% of known sort of estimated recruitment events, which is fine because you're not going to get the whole population, but there are also issues about where does this missing 60% come from? Do we think the PKK gives obituaries to people that it executes itself, or only to people who die in battle? So there's probably some type of selection happening there. So I use the recruitment variable despite these issues that I discussed in the paper, but in terms of the conventions in the broader sort of economic literature on conflict, the use of these both UCDP and ACLED data sets and the use of a binary measure of conflict seem to be the convention. So that's broadly the justification behind the dependent variable choice.
Çağlar?
Okay, thank you, Ollie. This is fascinating. As they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Obviously, it was a lot of work. I have a quick question. I grew up in Eastern Turkey, and there's a saying which says basically villages, not villagers, but villages have long memories. So bringing that, I mean, you would see the same voting patterns, right? Families vote the same way. I vote the same way my great-grandfather voted. So in that respect, what about irrigation? I'm worried about the endogeneity of the irrigation channels, because the governments always have a choice, you know, which path the irrigation channel is going to go, and you might prefer a Ashiret that has historically voted for you, or somebody against and go against you. So in that sense, that also deepens the conflict. Is there a way to control for it? And I will give you one idea. Do we have conflict or voting data from the 70s? Right, we're looking at how the villages voted for CHP versus AP. Will that be feasible? Thank you.
Thanks for that. And yeah, that is a very good point. So there are election results that go back before 2009. The issue is that they're aggregated either at the district level, often at the province level. So as a rough indicator, and if I aggregate my data up to that level as well, then perhaps that would be useful to compare pre and post. And yeah, so as I discuss in the choice of the IV model, the endogeneity of the irrigation variable is itself serious. So there are two ways of going about this. The first is that very simply in the panel models, I run two versions of the models in which I completely exclude all areas that don't receive irrigation. So if, for example, the government is building the canal towards an Ashiret that it has voted for it in the past, then that selection has already occurred, and we're only looking at areas that have already been selected on that basis. So we're not comparing irrigated areas to areas that never got irrigated. Like what you're saying is basically, if I've understood it correctly, that an area that never receives irrigation isn't a valid counterfactual for an area that does at some point receive irrigation, because the area that receives irrigation will have been selected for endogenous reasons. So I basically just I rerun the models and completely exclude areas that never receive irrigation. So these areas have already been selected on whatever endogenous principles the government is using for targeting. And the second way of getting around this is by using an instrument in which, in the cross-sectional models, I'm not actually using the irrigation values themselves. I'm using the fitted values of sort of predicted irrigation based on topography. And as much as the government can try, they can't alter that, right? And they can't target on that basis. So by assuming that topography is exogenous, which I also deal with, there's a caveat to that, which is above a certain level, it then it becomes endogenous again because the bases are in the mountains. But instead of using irrigation itself by using an instrument, topography, I try to account for the fact that this distribution of irrigation schemes may not itself be completely random.
Thank you, Oli. Maybe last few questions. So one question from Elif, I think. Elif, would you like to ask it?
Hi. Oli, this is a very interesting paper. So my question was actually a bit more about clarification on your data in terms of recruitment. So I'm a bit confused about how this recruitment data works, meaning that I think you told us that you looked at the obituaries. So that means that someone should be deceased so that this person is recruited. So then you might easily overestimate or underestimate the recruitment. So this was one thing, and also this is highly correlated with conflict as well. So if there's high conflict, more conflict, then there will be more disease, and there will be then more recruitment represented in the data. So I was curious about what you would have to say about this. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. And this is part of the reason why I moved from the recruitment variable to the conflict incidence variable as the primary dependent variable, although I do keep it as a robustness check. But both of those points are very valid. So the two sort of short answers to that, the first is that the recruitment data actually only goes up until 2012. And so given, sadly, the average lifespan of people in the PKK, that sort of 8-year gap between when the data set ended and now means that the bias from people who are unaccounted for, who are still alive, is realistically liable to be quite low because of just the turnover, especially given the fact that the conflict currently is in quite a high period. And yeah, just in general, I think the recruitment data is interesting. I do think it does have a lot of issues, which is why I switched to predominantly conflict incidents, but it does sort of have an interesting property in terms of being a robustness check, because the comparing coefficients across the conflict incidents and the recruitment models, even though realistically neither of them are perfect in terms of capturing the richness of actual conflict dynamics, by comparing both of these data sets, which are constructed completely independently of each other and actually measure quite different things, tells us something about the consistency of various control variables across both of them and the irrigation variable itself. So for example, like AKP vote share and HDP vote share behave very much in the same way across these two, even though they measure ostensibly quite different things. So I agree wholeheartedly with your issues with the data set, and that's partly why I've sort of moved towards a more standard measure of conflict. But I do think that using it as a robustness check to ensure consistency across these two like very differently calculated and very different sort of sources of information about the conflict does help us to like qualitatively interpret those results with slightly more confidence.
Thank you. Just very shortly, the reason that I'm asking this because I thought that the relation between the irrigation and the conflict, because higher irrigation, the lower the conflict, I thought that this is true lower recruitment. It's not just as a robustness test, but also this is the mechanism between this, irrigation. People are less likely to be volunteer or to be in the PKK. That's why there's lower conflict. But this is not the mechanism that you had in mind, I believe.
Right. Well, so I mean, the potential mechanism would be that in areas that receive irrigation and you have farmers who have a much higher opinion of the state, for example, they're probably less likely to join the PKK as well. So in that sense, yeah, it does act like the mechanism through which irrigation would affect conflict incidence would be through a reduction in recruitment per se, right? And so most, in fact, all literature on income shocks and conflict makes this assumption, right? So any literature that says that, for example, Harari and LaFerrara, this recent paper that shows that rainfall shocks are positively correlated with conflict incidents in Africa, that is based on the assumption that people join these rebel groups in lower numbers when they have sort of economic, like higher sort of income, right? And so the implicit assumption is that the mechanism through which these two things are, income is affecting conflict is through recruitment. It's just that in this instance, I have the rare sort of ability to look at recruitment itself. However, like there are issues with how reliable potentially that raw recruitment data is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Oli, for your patient answers to all these questions. And there's actually much more than the ones that I was able to give the stage for. But at the same time, we are 2 minutes beyond our promised end time. So I'm gonna say goodbye to you for today. Thank you very much for surviving with us until 6 p.m. on a London evening. I don't know what time it is in places where you are, but we appreciate it a lot. And hopefully tomorrow we'll meet again around the same time, 2 p.m. And we are gonna have 2 more sessions. And then in between those 2 sessions, we are gonna have a keynote speech with Shulala. So see you tomorrow and take care. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.